The CIA, according to my extensive research, that stands for Central Intelligence Agency. According to the internet, it's this secretive, borderline omnipresent, shadowy organization that's behind, well, everything. From assassinations to diseases to terrorist attacks to me getting rejected by every woman on Hinge. But is the CIA really that bad, or are schizos on the internet just exaggerating? The answer is yes. In this extremely short video, I'm gonna talk about a bunch of stuff that the CIA has been involved in throughout the years. Allegedly. When I say stuff, I mean like coups, blackmail, secret experiments, assassinations, and weird sex stuff, among other things. Now guys, I've done at least half a dozen hours of research for this, so hopefully this video will give you a better understanding of how the agency operates and the scope of their involvement in world events. I got all of these topics from this here iceberg chart, which I'll link in the description, and I know it's been a while since I've done one of these iceberg videos. If you're unfamiliar, it's just a long list of topics starting with the most well-known and ending with the most unknown. So let's get started. Oh, hang on. I should go get that.
Are you owner of a YouTube channel, Dantavius?
Yeah, that's me. Who the hell are you?
We got him.
What the? Yo! What's going on? What the fuck? Okay, guys, I don't know what's going on here. I think there's been a huge misunderstanding. Whatever my Uncle Ruben owes you, I have nothing to do with it.
Listen here, man. Don't bullshit us. We know you're making a CIA video, all right?
Yeah, but what the?
Hey!
Oh, fuck!
Shut up! Hey. Listen, if you say anything bad about the CIA, we're gonna lock you in a cage with a PD clone, okay?
What does that mean?
Okay?
Okay, what are you doing with that bucket of water?
You'll find out here in a second.
Oh!
Keep his head back. Keep him back.
Oh God! Okay, my neck. I have a neck thing.
This fucking towel smells, man.
Oh fuck!
You like that, motherfucker?
Getting water on my shoes, damn it. Let's get drowned, bitch.
Hey! Where'd you get those shoes from? What?
Don't worry about it. Fucking drown.
You got it on my suit, bro.
It is what it is. You gonna talk now, motherfucker? Huh?
I'm gonna be very.
You're gonna be very what? Huh?
I'm gonna make you guys look good.
All right. If not, we'll be back.
Please, just don't put me in a cage with the Diddy clone.
Remember that shit, man. Remember that shit.
Okay, I swear, I'm gonna be very generous.
You better be.
Okay, I think it's recording. Hey guys, so I just had a very nice chat with some very nice people from the CIA, and they assigned me a handler and everything, which is awesome. So I'm gonna be rewriting my script here, and should be getting it done in a few weeks. So. Basically, a black site is a secret prison that houses ghost inmates. Ooh. These inmates are not officially registered anywhere or charged with a crime, at least not on paper. The most famous black site is Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, but they have these places all over the world, including Thailand, Morocco, and worst of all, Romania. Honestly, the entire country of Romania should be considered a black site because living there is basically torture. Which brings me to my next point. If you read about black sites on the internet, you might find claims that the CIA tortures people in them, but that is simply not true. The US does not torture, okay? We practice enhanced interrogation, which is completely different, because it has a different name. Some of the CIA's enhanced interrogation techniques include, but are not limited to, beating, waterboarding, isolation, sleep deprivation, and starvation. So yeah, definitely not torture. Oh, and that was just the more normal stuff. There's also something called rectal feeding. Basically, they blend up food and they take this tube and stick it, you know what, I'm sure you can guess what it is on your own. Also, I would not recommend Googling that because it's also a weird fetish that I prefer not to ever think about again. And they would do this thing where they, and I'm not joking about this, try to make people go insane by playing the Barney and Friends theme song on a loop for several hours. Okay, so just imagine hearing this for like 3 days straight non-stop. Oh, you thought all that stuff was bad? Well, just wait. Because I read somewhere that they make inmates watch several episodes of Franklin the Turtle.
शायद इसका कोई मालिक नहीं है. शायद ये चाहता है कि कोई इसकी देखभाल करे.
Okay, talk about cruel and unusual. Okay, by episode 3, I would be telling them every secret I know just to make it stop. No, but seriously, a lot of people did die from these techniques, allegedly. What's even worse is that a lot of people who ended up in these black sites were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Take, for example, the case of Murat Kurnaz. Murat was from the Turkish town of Bremen, Germany. In 2001, he took a trip to Pakistan to visit some mosques there. On his way back home, he was arrested for basically no reason and was handed over to American soldiers. Apparently, the US Army had distributed a bunch of flyers promising people, quote, enough money to take care of your family, your village, and your tribe for the rest of your life. Life-changing amounts of money in exchange for turning in members of Al-Qaeda or the Taliban. As you can imagine, a lot of people were all of a sudden being accused of being terrorists. And Murat was just unlucky enough to wind up in Guantanamo Bay, where he experienced the following: beatings, endless solitary confinement, freezing temperatures and extreme heat, and days of forced sleeplessness. Well, at least that's if you believe him. Personally, I don't think our friends at the CIA would ever do any of that stuff. This alleged torture lasted 5 years before Germany pressured the Bush administration to let the man go. Now, the CIA is funded by Congress, but here's the thing. The CIA does a lot of stuff that those schmucks in Congress would consider unethical. So using traceable federal money is not really an option most of the time. That's where the black budget comes in. It's simply off-the-books money used to fund covert operations that are on a need-to-know basis. The money is obtained in many different ways, but I think it's best to give you an example. So let's talk about the Iran-Contra scandal, which, in my opinion, is one of the greatest uses of the black budget. Now, I made a whole ass video on this topic, but I'll briefly summarize here, and if you want to know more, you can watch that later. Ronald Reagan.
Ronald Reagan, the actor?
Yes, the actor. Reagan had a massive hard-on for a group called the Contras. He loved these men almost as much as he loved jelly beans. At one point, comparing them to the founding fathers.
I've spoken recently of the freedom fighters of Nicaragua. They are the moral equal of our founding fathers.
So who are they? In 1979, Nicaragua's US-backed dictator Anastasio Somoza was overthrown by a leftist group known as the Sandinistas. Now, Reagan was a big believer in Domino Theory, which is this idea that if one country becomes communist, it'll cause a chain reaction, and he wasn't about to let that happen in our backyard. So Reagan did everything in his power to back the Contras who were fighting against the Sandinista government. Only problem is the Contras were kind of naughty. Okay, and when I say naughty, I mean they were committing several war crimes. Amnesty International went to Nicaragua in the late 70s and documented what they called a pattern of executions, torture, mutilations, and kidnappings by Contra groups. Some of the victims were teachers and even priests. Damn, just like the founding fathers, bro. Remember when George Washington crossed the Delaware and just like murdered a bunch of civilians? Remember when John Hancock chopped off a guy's hand and his cock? When this stuff came to light, Congress passed the Boland Amendment, which essentially banned the CIA from helping the Contras and cut off all funding. But here's the thing, a lot of members of Reagan's administration didn't give a shit. They were gonna find a way to fund the Contras no matter what. And they used the black budget I was talking about. Since the CIA couldn't technically get involved, they found a way around that as well. This is where Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North comes in. He was on Reagan's National Security Council, and he was also a big fan of the Contras. Ollie came up with a simple two-step plan to fund the Contras. Step 1 was to get private donations, most of which came from Republican donors and also Saudi Arabia. Step 2 was to sell weapons to Iran. Now you might recall Iran is like one of our biggest nemesis. Some people would call what Ollie North did high treason, but you know what I call it? Good old-fashioned American patriotism and ingenuity. Ollie recruited this guy named Richard Secord, who started a private company that acquired weapons from the black market and sold them to Iran in exchange for freeing American hostages held in Lebanon. The proceeds from this weapon deal was then laundered through various offshore banks to the Contras. While all this was going on, the Contras were smuggling drugs into the United States to help fund their war against the Sandinistas, and the feds just kind of let it happen. But again, we will talk about that later. And it's fucking insane, okay? So stick around. Now, obviously, this stuff sounds very bad, very illegal, and should probably have left a massive stain on anyone involved at the very least. But pretty much everyone got away with it. George H.W. Bush pardoned everyone involved once he took office. Now let's bring it back to the CIA. On paper, it looked like the CIA had no involvement in these shenanigans, but Richard Secord, the guy who smuggled the weapons to Iran, admitted to meeting with CIA Director William Casey on at least 3 occasions to discuss aiding the Contras. Civil Air Transport was a passenger and cargo airline founded by American World War II veterans in 1946. At the time, China was still fighting a decades-long civil war with the communists on one side and Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists on the other. So CAT helped the nationalists by distributing aid and ammunition and transporting the nationalist soldiers. But it wasn't enough, because in 1949, the nationalists got their asses handed to them by the CCP, which caused a bit of a problem for CAT. Now that the war was over, they had nothing to do, and they were on the verge of bankruptcy. Luckily for them, the good old Central Intelligence Agency stepped in and secretly acquired them in 1950, which happened to be the same year that the Korean War started. CAT was rebranded to Air America, and they even had a new slogan, and let me tell you, they definitely lived up to that. Let's just say after the rebrand, the scope of their work went way beyond distributing aid. Air America was involved in a bunch of shady Cold War shenanigans in Southeast Asia from 1950 to 1976, all under the guise of being a regular civilian transportation company. They had bases all over the region from Taiwan to Japan, and most importantly, Laos. Laos was like ground zero for those Cold War shenanigans I was talking about. In 1959, a war broke out between communists and the Lao monarchy. By the mid-60s, the Royal Loyalists were starting to lose ground because the Reds were well supplied by the Chinese and North Vietnam. They needed a cash injection, and they needed one bad. So, like many other people desperate for money, they turned to a tried and true method: selling drugs. This is when Air America stepped in. They helped the Royalists distribute drugs all over the place. I mean, to be fair, their slogan was anything, anywhere, anytime, so you cannot accuse them of false advertising. You know, I gotta defend the CIA here, okay? It's like my Uncle Ruben always says, illegal drugs are an excellent way to fundraise. So, cut them some slack, okay? Funny thing is, as you'll come to see later in this video, this was not the first or only time that the CIA would facilitate the trafficking of drugs to fund anti-communist causes. Oh, and I should say allegedly, okay? Now, I don't really know how the word allegedly works. I assume if I say it in a sentence, it just makes me immune from getting sued. At least that's what my lawyer told me. But then again, he also caused me to lose custody of my kids and lose half my money to my ex-wife. I need a new lawyer. Actually, everybody should have a good lawyer. You never know when you're gonna need one. Like, imagine you're at the grocery store, okay? Are you imagining it? Now, imagine you're buying the essentials, cucumbers, saran wrap, and all of a sudden, you slip and fall and severely injure yourself. Turns out that the store had spilled liquids all over the ground and didn't put up a warning. Well, this actually happened to a lady in Florida. Luckily though, she called Morgan & Morgan, and they were able to get her a delicious $4.2 million payout. And you know, I'm not surprised. Just like there's a reason Donald Trump doesn't want the Epstein files released, there's a reason Morgan & Morgan is America's largest injury law firm. So far, they've recovered over $30 billion for over 500,000 clients. So if God forbid you're ever injured, you can check out Morgan & Morgan. Their fee is free unless they win. You can start your claim now by clicking the link in the description, or go to www.forthepeople.com/Dantavius, or by scanning this QR code on the screen from your phone's camera. And big shout out to Morgan & Morgan for sponsoring this video. A lot of advertisers did not want to touch this one, so shout out to them. And let's move on to the next thing. The disposition matrix is CIA speak for what US officials have described as a next-generation capture/kill list. The matrix database collects backgrounds, locations, associates, and affiliations for those on the kill list. It also contains strategies for finding, capturing, or killing them, or subjecting them to extraordinary renditions, which we'll talk about in a second here. The process for determining who goes on the list is classified, but if you happen to find yourself on this list, it's only a matter of time before your whole village is drone striked.
Wasn't as precise as it should have been, and there's no doubt that civilians were killed.
Allen Dulles is the reason that the CIA became what it is. He was instrumental in establishing the agency and served as its director between 1953 and 1961. Originally, he was part of the OSS,
Office of Strategic Services,
which was the CIA's precursor established during World War II. Now, there's not a lot of people in this world who I can say are more evil than my Uncle Reuben, but Allen Dulles was definitely one of these people. His paranoia about the spread of communism was so legendary that it made him do some downright devious shit, like collaborating with Nazis, for example. Right before the end of World War II, Dulles made a bunch of secret backroom deals with prominent Nazis behind President Roosevelt's back. He offered to help them escape justice in exchange for their aid in fighting against the Soviets. You know, all of a sudden his choice of facial hair makes a lot more sense. He was also the guy behind MK Ultra, a series of highly unethical and illegal mind control experiments, which we will cover up later as well. Damn, I'm doing a lot of subtle foreshadowing here. When the CIA was established in 1947, it was a modest agency focused on gathering and analyzing intelligence, but under Dulles, it morphed into a whole new beast. He believed that for the CIA to function effectively, they had to operate outside of the government without all that oversight. He also was not opposed to doing very evil shit in the pursuit of what he believed was the greater good, i.e. stopping communism. So most of the super f***ed up things the CIA did were under his watch.
The idea that it is necessarily nefarious, it's always engaged in overthrowing governments, that's false. Now there are times.
I think it's established that the United States was not a big fan of having communist countries anywhere near us. So when Fidel Castro overthrew US-backed Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista, you can imagine folks in the White House were not very happy, and they immediately started plotting ways to overthrow Castro. In 1960, at the behest of Dwight Eisenhower, the CIA began training anti-Castro Cuban exiles in Guatemala to invade and take back their homeland. But the plan didn't go into effect until after Kennedy got into office. In February of 1961, shortly after taking office, JFK okayed the invasion, but he wanted to make sure that it seemed like a homegrown grassroots revolution and not a US-backed coup. That's why the Bay of Pigs was chosen as the landing point, as it was a remote area in the south of Cuba. Genius level gambit. Clearly, if the US was involved, they would invade from the north, since the US is in the north. So here was the plan. First, a team of bombers disguised as Cuban Air Force planes would fly in from Guatemala and take out Castro's two main air bases, leaving them vulnerable to a ground invasion. Then, the main invasion force of 1,500 men would land on the beach in the dead of night and launch a surprise attack. A smaller team of paratroopers would drop in prior to the invasion and, using guerrilla tactics, would disrupt Cuban infrastructure. Then, another invasion force would land on Cuba's east side to create even more chaos and confusion. The CIA was banking on a lot of people joining the exiles, which would spark a full-blown revolution. Absolutely foolproof plan. Let's see how it all played out. On April 15th, 1961, the bombers left Guatemala and bombed Cuba's air bases according to plan. Except the pilots missed their targets and barely made a dent in Castro's Air Force. To make matters worse, photos were taken of the planes and it was clear that they were just shittily painted American B-52 bombers. Alright, not a great start, but there was still phase 2. 2 days later, on April 17th, the ground force landed in the Bay of Pigs. They immediately got smashed harder than your mom on a Wednesday afternoon. I mean, they really got destroyed. In just 3 days, the anti-Castro revolution was completely crushed. This was an absolute embarrassment for the United States and created a rift between Kennedy and the CIA. JFK blamed them for the colossal f***up and forced Allen Dulles to resign. The CIA's power level would be nerfed after this, which, as you can imagine, probably made them very upset. Upset enough to, I don't know, maybe do something drastic. Also guys, please take everything I say with a grain of salt. Obviously I can't dive too deep into these topics because I'm doing so many of them, so I'm probably gonna have a lot of mistakes and generalizations. So just consider this like an entry point. If you guys really want to know more about the CIA, I'm gonna list a few books that I read in the description of this video. Now you guys might be aware of this, but there were many attempts on Fidel Castro's life. After the Bay of Pigs, there was an entire wing of the CIA dedicated to coming up with ways to assassinate Castro. Some of these plans were typical, like poisoning his food or paying the mafia to whack him, but the boys in black suits quickly realized that Castro maxed out his luck stat and that all of their schemes failed. So the assassination plots became increasingly Looney Tunes-esque. Alright, here are a few of my favorites. When the CIA found out that Castro loved scuba diving, they tried to poison his wetsuit. When that didn't work, they planned to put an exploding seashell next to his favorite dive spot. Close but no cigar. Oh, and speaking of cigars, they literally tried to off this man with an exploding cigar. Apparently this plan was cooked up by Agent Wile E. Coyote. Oh, another thing they tried was painting a tunnel on the side of a mountain hoping that Castro's car would crash into it, but that also failed. The closest the CIA ever got was when they recruited one of Castro's gumas to poison him, but this plan was also thwarted when she ended up sleeping with him instead. She later told a newspaper that he actually handed her his gun and told her, quote, "You can't kill me. Nobody can kill me." Bro, honestly, I don't know if I agree with his politics, but this dude was cool as hell. You cannot deny that. You know, I would rip some nitrous with Castro for sure. Aside from the assassination attempts, there were also a lot of plans to discredit or humiliate Castro, like the time the CIA tried to spray him with LSD, hoping that he would freak out on live TV and embarrass himself. By the way, they were doing this shit as recently as 2000. That year, a bunch of explosives were planted at a podium where Castro was set to do a speech, but his security team discovered the explosives before they went boom. Now, the CIA only documented a total of 8 attempts on Castro's life, but the head of his Secret Service claimed that a total of 634 attempts were made. So I'm guessing the real number's probably somewhere in between. So I submitted my MKUltra section to my CIA handler, and let's just say he did not like it very much and wanted me to put a more positive spin on it. So here's my second attempt. MKUltra was the CIA's super duper top secret mind control program. Not long after World War II, Allen Dulles was convinced that the Soviet Union and China had figured out how to control people's minds.
At the end of the Korean War, a number of freed American POWs came home seemingly brainwashed and espousing communist propaganda. American officials suspected that the soldiers had been subjected to what they thought were new communist mind control techniques.
So the CIA decided that they needed their own mind control program, and it had 3 main objectives. One was to erase memories. As you can imagine, this is a very useful tool for espionage. Also, it's useful when you drink too much and poop your pants at a cabin in front of all your friends. 2 was brainwashing, aka making people do or say what you want them to do or say, that's obvious. And 3, implanting false memories. These objectives culminated into the ultimate goal of the program: creating a Manchurian candidate. You've probably heard that term thrown around before. It's just another word for a sleeper agent. basically an unwitting assassin. So this Manchurian candidate, this MC, if you will, would be brainwashed into whacking a specific target and have their brain discombobulated, so their memories of being brainwashed and of assassinating the person would completely be wiped from their dome. And finally, they would have a bunch of false memories implanted to throw off investigators. Now, I think we can all agree that having a Manchurian candidate is essential to national security. So that's why Dulles recruited Dr. Sidney Gottlieb to run MKUltra. You know, under normal circumstances, I would call this guy a demon or a putz or a jerk, but really he was a patriot and a genius. Gottlieb was convinced that some combination of drugs, hypnosis, and psychological manipulation could create the ideal Manchurian candidate. Under his watch, the CIA tried out every possible combination of those things. Gottlieb had a particular interest in how drugs impact people's brains. So he started testing out a bunch of different drugs like peyote, mescaline, nitrous oxide, but mainly LSD. Under his watch, the CIA would give people large doses of LSD without their knowledge or consent. A lot of the test subjects were prisoners held in black sites who were given a ton of drugs to see how it affected interrogation. Now, of course, the studies weren't limited to just prisoners, they also included just random ass people. Gottlieb was known in intelligence circles for throwing parties and spiking people's drinks with LSD so he could observe their behavior. Allegedly, one of his guests got so distraught after being dosed that he later jumped out of a window. I've been told that this is an unrelated accident and to not ask any questions about it, so I will move on. Another interesting practice Gottlieb had was recruiting doctors around the US to give LSD to their patients, usually without consent. For example, if a patient signed up for a drug trial, let's say, these hospitals would just give them LSD instead of the drug that they thought they would be getting. Some of the victims of MKUltra went insane, some of them ended up becoming terrorists, and others took their own lives. But some of them had a good time, I assume. In the end, though, these experiments, which have been called illegal and highly unethical, not by me, didn't produce the desired results, and the program was officially shut down in 1973. Now, I say officially because some people think that the project never ended, and the CIA was only claiming they didn't achieve their goal as like a smokescreen, when in fact, they did figure out mind control and have been using it ever since. Oh, and another thing, I actually found out that Matthew Santoro was 50 amazing facts were used to... There's probably like 170,000 videos deep diving into the JFK conspiracy, so I'm not gonna go too deep into it here. Go watch Lamino or something. So after the assassination, there was this thing called the Warren Commission, which was an investigation into the assassination, and it concluded that Oswald acted alone. Well, one of the people on the Warren Commission was our boy, Allen Dulles. Now, as we know, Dulles was not the CIA director at this point because Kennedy fired him. Some people have suggested that Dulles worked with the current CIA director to withhold information from the rest of the commission. For example, some information that the Warren Commission would have found interesting was the fact that the CIA had been monitoring Oswald's mail through HT Lingual. So Oswald moved to the Soviet Union in 1959, and the feds had been monitoring his mail ever since. They were at least aware of who this guy was, and they knew what he was writing in his letters, yet that information was withheld from the Warren Commission. The prevailing theory here is that Kennedy had a falling out with the CIA after the Bay of Pigs, and he wanted to limit their powers, so they whacked him. And then this theory branches off in two directions. The more basic version is that Oswald was a decoy, and there was another shooter in the grassy knoll. The more schizo theory is that Oswald was a brainwashed Manchurian candidate victim of MKUltra. Oh, and speaking of MKUltra, this rabbit hole goes even deeper. You guys are probably aware that before Oswald could go to trial, he was shot by a guy named Jack Ruby. Well, according to this book, Chaos by Tom O'Neill, before Ruby was set to go to trial, he was visited by a guy named Jolly West. Don't let his name throw you off, because this man was a demon. Jolly West was a psychiatrist and researcher who was tasked with questioning and psychologically evaluating Ruby. Now, Jack Ruby himself said that he, quote, lost his senses when he pulled his gun out and shot Oswald, and that he had no memory of what he did. Now, here's the crazy part. It was later revealed that Jolly West was literally part of MKUltra, despite denying it his whole life. Now get this, his specific area of expertise was apparently implanting false memories or deleting memories in people, something which he had supposedly done in the past. So, do what you will with that information. Google. I refuse to say anything bad about them because, well, they are my boss. But maybe if you join my Patreon or become a channel member, I'll have more to say there. Maybe there's a longer version of this video on there. Maybe you can also get early access to my content plus other stuff. Might be worth checking out. I don't know. Link in description. Radio Free Europe was an anti-communist media outlet. I'll give you a guess who funded them. RFE transmitted to pretty much every communist country. Their news varied from cutting-edge journalism exposing atrocities done by communist governments to straight-up pro-Western propaganda.
Peter Zaboy escaped from Hungary when he was 12. Now he's working for the people he left behind. He brings young Hungarians closer to the world their government censors. Information with a beat.
I'm over here stroking my dick. I got lotion on my dick right now. I'm just stroking my shit.
Now, some of the leaders of these communist countries saw RFE as a huge threat to their power. Specifically, Romanian President Nicolae Ceausescu, who orchestrated the bombing of their headquarters in Munich. Now guys, I cannot stress this enough. The CIA does not do kidnappings. They do not kidnap people. That would be wrong. What they do instead is extraordinary renditions, which is a euphemism for kidnapping. But it's not as bad, because it's a different term. Extraordinary renditions are a policy of kidnapping a person from a foreign country and taking them to a black site for some good old-fashioned enhanced interrogations.
Hello, this is Agent Green from the CIA-sponsored PSYOP YouTube channel dubbed Necessary Information. Me and the boys here at Langley took a look at Dan's original recording for this segment. It was actually so bad, so unpatriotic and unfunny, really just total hack shit. I mean, it sounded like Matthew Santoro wrote it in MS Paint. It was so bad that we had to hit him with some extraordinary rendition to one of our Moldovan black sites and perform some enhanced interrogation directly onto his face and chest, as is CIA protocol. Anyway, while Dan's rear end heals up from that, I've been assigned to tell you what really happened with Operation Midnight Climax. You see, back in the 60s, a lot of our agents were getting really pent up and aggro. They saw the hippies out there getting to have all the fun and unprotected sex in the mud, while they had to sit there filing paperwork and torturing people all day. I mean, not torturing, interrogating people. So we decided to create a project to help them blow off some steam for the good of the American people. Operation Midnight Climax, a sub-program of our larger award-winning ethically non-monogamous operation, MKUltra. We started by setting up brothels in the disgusting, debaucherous, and homosexual hippie hotbeds of San Francisco and New York City. We offered these upstanding ladies $100, which is the equivalent to $3 billion today, for every John that they could lure back into one of our CIA brothels. Yes, a bounty not for collecting heads, but for We also assigned these girls the task of secretly dosing their targets with oodles of LSD without their knowledge before bringing them back to the compound. Once the gals had successfully lured this petty prostitute purchaser into the room, the John would sometimes notice the enormous, very out-of-place mirror covering the majority of one of the 4 walls. This, of course, made no difference to him, as by this point he was far too horny and drugged up to care, and was probably just excited to recreate that one scene from American Psycho. Now, unknown to him, this was actually a 2-way mirror, some new technology that we had picked up from the boys over at Area 51. Behind the mirror was a secret room full of proud and patriotic CIA agents, as well as recording equipment, a mini fridge full of martinis, and a portable toilet, so our boys could shit, drink, and spy on some dude tripping nuts while nuts deep in somebody's daughter all at the same time. Why, you ask, would we do this? Well, for science. And national security purposes, of course. On the books, this operation was set up for the agency to study sexual blackmail, mind control, and the use of drugs in interrogation and psychological manipulation. Also, internet didn't exist yet, so people went to some pretty crazy lengths to get off. I am serious about the martini mini fridge and toilet, by the way. That wasn't a joke or exaggeration. They actually had those back there. We pride ourselves on accuracy here at Langley. Oh, and by the way, I'm gay. Now, sometimes our gals would have a slow night and weren't able to bring any Johns back to our brothels. But our agents still needed to jack it hardcore behind that mirror, so that's when we would switch to Plan B. Our boys would go troll the streets near the compound in search of heroin addicts, who they would then bribe with some of the agency's near unending supply of heroin, kept in the CIA heroin vault under the Lincoln statue in DC, to take some LSD and then pork the gals in front of us. Again, for science and national security. Our brave agents would also often dip into the LSD supply themselves, and of course would often dip their dingers into the agency's prostitutes as well. Activities all fully funded by you, the American taxpayer. So there you have it, the real agency-approved declassified scoop on Operation Midnight Climax. I'm now getting word that the low-down, commie-loving, degenerate piece of human filth codenamed Dantavius is finally able to sit down again. So I'll let you folks get back to listening to his teachings on our nation's great Central Intelligence Agency. Agent Green of the PSYOP YouTube channel Necessary Information signing off. Back to you, Dan, you vile, nitrous-addicted, America-hating piece of garbage. Franklin the Turtle is a national hero, you freak!
You guys probably learned about the Watergate Scandal in 7th grade social studies. To refresh your brain, on June 17th, 1972, 5 men associated with Nixon's re-election campaign broke into the Democratic National Committee headquarters and installed listening devices so they could spy on the competition. These men were either straight-up CIA agents or assets. Even though they all denied it and Nixon tried to cover it up, the truth eventually came out. Now, Nixon's ties to the CIA go way back. In fact, Nixon was handpicked by Allen Dulles to be Dwight Eisenhower's vice president. The CIA would thrive under the Eisenhower administration, in large part thanks to support from Nixon. Also, his nickname was Tricky Dick, which is funny. Once all of this shady stuff was uncovered by Congress, they passed a bunch of laws that effectively neutered the intelligence agencies. So post-76, they had to be extra careful about not getting caught doing their borderline illegal and morally questionable covert activities. Or at least that was the case until a former CIA director became the vice president and then later president. Television. Is there a better way to spread propaganda than to subtly include it in your favorite movies and TV shows? Actually, most of the time it isn't very subtle, unless you have like zero media literacy. Now, there are several films that are confirmed to have ties to the CIA. These include, but are not limited to, Patriot Games, Clear and Present Danger, The Hurt Locker, Zero Dark 30, Argo, and basically any movie where the CIA is the good guys. And weirdly enough, Shrek 2, if you like any of those, turns out you like CIA propaganda, which is okay, it's fine. Like, they make some bangers, bro. Also, I have no proof to back this up, but I personally think that James Cameron's Avatar has to be a CIA psyop, because there's no way this piece of absolute dog shit should have ever been that successful.
Unobtainium.
Now, the CIA Hollywood connections go all the way back to World War II. Before the CIA even existed, several filmmakers joined the OSS, the precursor to the CIA. According to the CIA's own website, these filmmakers were recruited to make morale-building films and war documentaries, aka propaganda. The most famous example of that time was Cloak and Dagger, starring Gary Cooper. Whatever happened to Gary Cooper? The strong, silent type, who unwittingly acted in CIA propaganda films. Now, this all changed in the 1950s, where the CIA preferred not to be mentioned at all in media. So they pulled away from entertainment media and instead focused their attention on manipulating the news. Back in his day, Allen Dulles recruited hundreds of US and foreign journalists as assets, and it was mostly to withhold information about his agency. This would change again in 1996. Under the Clinton administration, the CIA started directly working with film studios to improve their image, which, as you can imagine, had deteriorated a lot by that point. Bro, that's only the first fucking layer, bro. This is gonna take forever. The Iraqi National Congress was a coalition of groups that opposed Saddam Hussein. This included Kurdish militia groups, fundamentalist Sunni clerics, Arab nationalists, and even people who wanted to restore Iraq's monarchy. Now, these are groups who, under normal circumstances, would never work together. Yeah, they all hated Saddam, but they also hated each other. But there was one other thing they all had in common. They were all being given money by the CIA. In 1991, George H. Dubb authorized the CIA to create the conditions for Saddam's removal. So they created the INC and supplied them with millions of dollars. Some of that money was used on sabotage operations like blowing up oil refineries. Don't know if it really helped much, but the group persisted all the way up until the 2003 US invasion, and it was a complete shit show after Saddam was toppled. A lot of infighting and backstabbing between all the various factions. Who could have predicted that? The story of solidarity begins in Poland. In the 1970s, Poland's economy was in pretty bad shape. Workers were pissed. Things came to a head in 1976 when massive protests broke out after Poland's prime minister announced an increase on food prices. The protests were, of course, met with violent repression by the police, but this repression led to the establishment of underground labor unions. Here's an excerpt from a news story from back in the day. The Soviet Union attacked the leaders of Poland's striking workers yesterday, accusing them of links with subversive centers abroad. And they were absolutely correct. They were being funded by the CIA to the tune of $12 million a year. And get this, the president of Solidarity eventually became the president of the entire country. The CIA denied funding it and actively hid their involvement by paying the trade union exclusively through third-party middlemen. And Reagan really seemed like he enjoyed that, I guess, almost as much as he liked paying himself. After the Chinese Communist Party beat the nationalists, they immediately set their sights on Tibet. While not officially recognized as its own country, Tibet had its own de facto government separate from China since 1912. But in 1950, that would change when the CCP annexed Tibet in what they called a peaceful liberation. Not sure a military invasion counts as peaceful, but maybe they mean it like in the Orwellian sense, like war is peace type shit. To be fair, China's initial invasion of Tibet was pretty tame as far as invasions go. Like, they killed a bunch of soldiers but no civilians, so I mean, really not that bad, honestly. But that was enough to make a point. The Tibetan government ended up signing an agreement that effectively brought Tibet under Chinese control while giving it semi-autonomy and religious freedom. At first, things went pretty well, you know, because Tibet was a theocratic, feudalistic backwater and China brought them some much-needed modernization. But the CCP slowly started tightening its grip on the region and discontent started to grow. By 1954, the Tibetans engaged in full-on guerrilla warfare. The communists responded by beating monks, bombing monasteries, and kidnapping Tibetan children for re-education. See, I don't like the sound of that. They should have called it extraordinary renditions instead of kidnapping. After these skirmishes, China went mask off. They took extreme measures to completely wipe out any Tibetan opposition. Over the next decade, 1.2 million Tibetans were either killed or displaced, while thousands were put in labor camps. Meanwhile, Han Chinese were brought in to resettle the area. By 1980, Han Chinese outnumbered Tibetans. Hey, wow, I think there's a name for that process. Forget what it is, though. Now, I don't know how much of this is exaggerated by US propaganda, but even the Soviet Union accused China of genocide. Genocide, that's the word. Keep in mind, this was after relations had broke down between the two of them. Russia and China were both accusing each other of human rights abuses. It was kind of like the Spider-Man pointing meme. Anyways, let's bring it back. The CIA saw these struggles of the Tibetan people, and out of an abundance of empathy and compassion, they decided to help them. The Tibetan resistance was supplied with tons of guns and ammo. Only problem is, most of these guys were peasants who had never held a gun before, so the CIA set up a guerrilla training program in Nepal. They also convinced them to participate in a bunch of operations that would benefit the United States, like stealing intel and attacking Chinese chemical plants. In 1959, things really started heating up, and the Dalai Lama, which was like the Pope of Tibet, was called to Beijing by the CCP. The Tibetans, fearing that their religious leader was about to be kidnapped and tortured or something, went into a full-on revolt. The CIA feared that if anything happened to the Dalai Lama, morale would hit the floor and the resistance would collapse. So they helped smuggle him out of the country into India, where he continues to live in exile today. The CIA continued funding the Tibetans, by 1964 spending more than $1.4 million a year in Tibet, until 1972 when Nixon normalized relations with China. In 1960, Eisenhower already decided that Castro had to go, but after the failure of the Bay of Pigs, the Kennedy administration wanted to eat his leftist ass.
I will eat your leftist ass like corn on the cob. I'm ready.
So Kennedy authorized a multi-agency campaign to do the thing that the Bay of Pigs was supposed to do: destabilize Cuba and remove Castro. This whole operation was led by JFK's brother, Robert, since he no longer trusted the CIA to call the shots. They were still involved in some capacity, but were now being micromanaged. Unlike the Bay of Pigs, Mongoose would focus on smaller scale covert operations that could not be traced back to the US. Kennedy learned from his mistakes and decided to make plausible deniability the #1 goal. So a lot of these operations focused on using Cuban middlemen to attack civilian infrastructure like sugar refineries and power plants. Now, some people would say, hey, isn't that terrorism? But I would have to disagree. It's not terrorism when we do it. Also, it's not like that many people died, come on. I mean, at least not directly. The Kennedy administration also tried to destroy Cuba's economy by forcing other countries like Jordan, Iran, Greece, Japan, and Israel to stop trading with them. The hope was that the Cuban economy would completely implode and people would be so frustrated that it would spark a revolution against Castro. A fine theory, but it didn't work. All this ended up doing was pushing Cuba closer to the USSR. All of this schmuckery made Castro think that a full-blown US invasion of Cuba was imminent. Can you blame him? So this, along with the assassination attempts and the Bay of Pigs, directly led to the Cuban Missile Crisis when Khrushchev secretly deployed nuclear weapons to Cuba. And that almost turned the entire Earth into a snow globe, so yeah. Project Mockingbird was a CIA-run wiretapping operation ordered by President Kennedy. It all started back in 1962. This New York Times reporter, Hanson Baldwin, apparently revealed classified information in an article which really pissed off Kennedy. So his brother Robert asked the FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, to tap that man's line. Hoover took some time away from his busy schedule of dressing like a woman and having sex with other to do that. As JFK became increasingly more paranoid of leakers, this program grew from one journalist to several people. In 1963, Kennedy tapped the CIA to officially put Project Mockingbird into effect, which gave the CIA permission to tap the phones of journalists and figure out where they were getting their insider info. Keep in mind that the CIA was not allowed to do this at all. They were not allowed to get involved in domestic affairs. Not that that ever stopped them. But I mean, I guess it just goes to show that Kennedy wasn't, as squeaky clean as we like to think. In 2011, the CIA set up a fake vaccination program to steal people's DNA so that they could find Osama bin Laden.
Holy crap. Did you just say fake vaccination program to try and catch Osama bin Laden?
Yeah. In the early 2010s, the US was closing in on bin Laden. They narrowed down his location to a compound near Abbottabad in Pakistan. But they didn't want to just go in guns blazing and have a Pakistani version of Waco on their hands. After all, that would be a PR nightmare. So we had to be 110% sure that this really was the place. So the good old boys at Central Intelligence concocted a very normal plan. They paid a Pakistani doctor to organize a free vaccination program near Abbottabad. The aim of this was not to save lives, but to take people's blood so that they could analyze the DNA. The idea was that bin Laden was hiding out with his large family, and I guess one of them would inevitably want to get a free vaccine for some reason. So using the DNA they obtained from these people, they would compare it to the DNA of bin Laden's sister, which they somehow had, and they could use that to figure out that yes, he was there. This plan did not work at all. All they achieved was, sowing a bunch of distrust in potentially life-saving medicine and undermining the credibility of vaccines. Cool. This is yet another case of the CIA allowing drugs to be brought into the United States. What the fuck, man? The French Connection was a drug smuggling operation run by a Corsican gangs out of Marseille, France. They would smuggle opium from Southeast Asia and Turkey, turn it into heroin, and then traffic it into Western Europe and the United States. According to the CIA's own documents, most of the heroin consumed in the US from the 30s to the 70s passed through this network. Now, we already know that the CIA and its predecessor, the OSS, partnered with the mafia, but evidence suggests that they turned a blind eye to this drug network in exchange for cooperation in fighting the French Communist Party, who at the time was extremely influential in Marseille. Mohammad Mossadegh was elected Prime Minister of Iran in 1951. Now, Mossadegh was pretty popular among his people, but he wasn't popular where it mattered, in England. You see, Mossadegh committed the cardinal sin of nationalizing his country's oil industry, which had previously been controlled by British Petroleum. Yes, the oil spill guys. BP tried to negotiate with Mossadegh, but they just couldn't handle how based he was, so with no options left, it was time for a coup. Winston Churchill basically gaslit the Eisenhower administration into believing that Mossadegh was low-key working with the Soviets. Now, it should be mentioned that Mossadegh was a proponent of secular liberal democracy, things that we in the US claim to be big fans of. But back in those days, even a whiff of communism was enough to do a coup. So Eisenhower gave the CIA the green light to overthrow the prime minister. The CIA's man on the ground was a fellow by the name of Kermit Roosevelt, grandson of Teddy Roosevelt. Now, on the surface, this man looks like a fucking dweeb. He looks like he speaks softly and carries a small stick, but this guy was an absolute demon. He was given a black budget of $1 million, which was a lot of money back then. And let me tell you, it did not go to waste. Kermit had a 4-point plan to take over the country. First was to turn public opinion against Mossadegh. He did this by bribing the press to put out anti-Mossadegh propaganda and by allying himself with the Islamic clergy. The second step was to have the Shah dismiss Mossadegh from parliament. Third was to pay mobs of protesters to riot in the streets and hope that Mossadegh fights back, which would spark an organic revolution. And finally, they would declare a CIA asset as the new prime minister. Now, there was one problem with this plan. When Kermit asked the Shah to dismiss MM, he said, "Are you out of your fucking mind?" Now, the Shah was no fan of Mossadegh, who had been slowly stripping away his power after taking office. But the King of Kings was no dummy. He knew that this would be a stupidly unpopular move that would likely turn the Iranian people against him. But after a lot of convincing intimidation and a substantial bribe, the Shah finally acquiesced. Now, step one went off without a hitch. The propaganda was flowing. But when they got to step two, that's when they started running into problems. Turns out that the Shah was 100% right in his assessment that dismissing Mossadegh would be very incredibly stupidly unpopular. Mossadegh's supporters went ballistic and started protesting, forcing the Shah to flee the country out of fear of being arrested or worse. So the coup was an absolute bumbaclot failure. But Kermit didn't give up. He stayed in Iran and continued doing black magic shit behind the scenes, and eventually he was able to sow enough discontent that a full-blown coup eventually did break out, and Zahedi was able to arrest Mossadegh and take his place as prime minister. The Shah quickly returned from exile and consolidated power. As a thank you for the US's help, he signed over some of Iran's oil fields to US companies. This was an absolutely genius level play by the CIA. And hey, it's not like they could have predicted that this would sow a deep discontent with the West that would eventually lead to a government whose catchphrase is literally "Death to America." The Bank of Credit and Commerce International, or BCCI, was a financial institution started in 1972 that operated out of Pakistan. Among US intelligence, though, it had another name, the Bank of Crooks and Criminals, which, to be fair, could be used to describe pretty much every bank, but this one was even worse, trust me. BCCI got up to all sorts of wacky stuff like money laundering, drug smuggling, funding terrorism, and worst of all, financing bootleg Nintendo games. Bank provided services for a slew of shady characters like Saddam Hussein, Manuel Noriega, terrorist groups, drug cartels, and the CIA. Central Intelligence got involved with BCCI sometime in the late 70s. The bank basically managed the CIA's black budget. Whenever something needed to be done off the books, BCCI would handle it. Like, for example, funding the Contras in Nicaragua often went through them. There's a whole nother part to this. When the CIA found out about BCCI's other clients, they found a new use for the bank, collecting intel and profiling all the criminals and terrorists that worked with the bank. It was a win-win. They got to do illegal shit, they got access to everyone else doing illegal shit, so if they ever got caught, they could just say, oh, well, we were only using this bank to keep tabs on all these other criminals and stuff. Which is exactly what they did. In 1991, BCCI's illicit activities were revealed to the world. That's when the American public found out about the CIA's involvement with them. But it blew over pretty quickly because the Soviet Union dissolved, which was a much bigger news story. Talk about perfect timing, huh? The Golden Triangle refers to this region here between Burma, Laos, and Thailand. The term Golden Triangle was coined by the CIA, not because the area was full of gold. No. It's full of something much better. Sweet opium. Before Afghanistan became the biggest player in the opium game, the Golden Triangle was the place to get opium. And opium accessories like heroin and morphine. So there were a couple different ways that the CIA was complacent in drug smuggling in that area. After the Kuomintang, aka the Chinese nationalists, lost the civil war, many of them fled to Burma and Thailand, and the CIA was hoping that they would hamper the communists if they ever tried pushing into those regions. But it turns out that the Kuomintang was much better at trafficking drugs than fighting communists. Now, that was only one leg of the operation. Another way in which the CIA was involved with drugs in that area was through Air America. Let me introduce you to the UFC. No, not that UFC, not the one where the owner beats his wife, denies his fighters healthcare, and pays them absolute dog shit. The other UFC, which is actually more psychotic, is the United Fruit Company. In the mid-20th century, they dominated the global banana trade, which somehow made them one of the most powerful corporations in the world. People really liked bananas back then. By the 1930s, they owned most of the land in Guatemala, which obviously gave them a ton of influence over the country. Between 1931 to 44, Guatemala's president Jorge Ubico was a puppet of the Banana Empire. During that time, Guatemala basically had a feudal system, and most of the peasant class was made up of ethnic Mayans. Ubico forced a bunch of them to work on banana plantations and just generally treated them like shit. Inspired by FDR's New Deal, a democratic movement took root and quickly gained steam. Eventually, most of the country backed the movement and Ubico was forced to resign. In 1945, the country held its first presidential election, which was won by Juan Jose Aravelo, a university professor who had been exiled from the country previously. He was insanely popular, and more importantly, he still kept a working relation going with the UFC. Arevalo, damn, I was saying, did I spell this right? Wait, it's Arevalo was succeeded by a guy named Jacopo Guzman in 1951. Guzman was much less moderate than his predecessor. He actually seized the UFC's land and redistributed it to the Guatemalan people, about 600,000 acres total. United Fruit was absolutely pissed and demanded that Guzman at least pay them a bunch of money for the land, but when he refused, he sealed his fate. The United Fruit Company went straight to their dad, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Now, let me tell you, the D stands for don't f with the money. Eisenhower told his boy Allen Dulles to get to work, and the CIA created Operation PBSuccess, which I believe stands for peanut butter success because, you know, peanut butter, bananas.
Peanut butter jelly time.
The goal of this operation was to overthrow the democratically elected president of Guatemala and to replace him with a hand-picked CIA asset, Carlos Castilla Armas, who, if you couldn't tell by his mustache, was a literal fascist. The CIA gave him all the money and training he needed to do a coup. But before the actual coup, the CIA spent millions of dollars on a psychological warfare campaign to discredit and demonize Guzman, and it worked. In June of 1954, Armas, along with a small force of a few hundred men, plus CIA spy planes, invaded Guatemala and successfully took over the country. The rest was history. He made good on all the promises he made to the US government. 1.5 million acres were returned to the United Fruit Company, and he outlawed most of Guatemala's trade unions. Anyone who complained was made a victim of Armas's death squads. It wouldn't be long before a civil war broke out, which led to a genocide of the Mayan people in northern Guatemala, who were seen as siding with the rebels. You know, I'm kind of starting to think that a lot of these countries would be better off if we didn't interfere. Actually, no, I take it back. Regime change is good. Chile, 1970. Guy named Salvador Allende is running for president as a member of the Socialist Party. His campaign was financially backed by Cuba and the USSR. Naturally, the United States could not allow this, so they spent hundreds of thousands of dollars running a so-called spoiling operation, i.e. paying for anti-Allende media and supporting his opponent. But that didn't pan out, and Allende became president anyways. So the United States allowed the will of the people to dictate the country's future. Oh wait, no, they did a coup. At least tried to. The CIA met with Chilean military officers to try and get a coup going before Allende could even take office. But this also failed, and he went on to serve as president. So this is when the CIA decided to play the long game. Over the next 3 years, they spent $8 million, or $59 million in today's money, slowly shoring up the opposition to Allende's rule, cutting off international aid, stifling their ability to take out IMF loans, and most importantly, giving money to anti-government military groups. And it was working. The US had successfully done everything in its power to make it as hard as possible to run the country. Negative sentiment against Allende quickly grew. In 1973, the military launched a coup against him, bombing the presidential palace. Allende ended his life before they could get to him. This is when a guy named Augusto Pinochet took his place. What happened next is the same thing that happens every time a democratically elected president is overthrown and replaced by a US-backed strongman. A massive nationwide anti-communist manhunt. Tens of thousands of people were rounded up and thrown into internment camps. Not even celebrities were safe, with popular folk singer Victor Java being killed in one of the camps. Pinochet's most infamous shtick was the helicopter rides. When he wanted to get rid of someone, his goons would load them into a helicopter, get as high up as possible, and, well, sure, you can figure out what happens next. Now, I don't want to be accused of having an anti-Pinochet bias here, so I'm just going to be fair and say that the helicopter rides were pretty fun. All of this stuff was being directly supported by US Secretary of State / demonic Keebler elf Henry Kissinger. By the late 80s, the Cold War started going in the US's favor, and they tried to distance themselves from Pinochet's atrocities. In 1988, lacking support from both the US and his own generals, a referendum was held and Pinochet was removed from office. By that point, he ruled for 17 years and 38,000 people were imprisoned, and thousands more were whacked. Back in the 80s, this guy right here had a monopoly on the cocaine trade. He was moving tons, literally tons of cocaine, so much cocaine.
You moved $900 million worth of cocaine. Or more.
In today's dollars is the equivalent of $2.5 billion.
But the real question is, where was Rick Ross getting all of this cocaine?
I was getting my coke from a guy by the name of Oscar Danilo Blandon.
Oscar Danilo Blandon was heavily connected to the government of Anastasio Somoza. After the Sandinista revolution toppled Somoza's regime, Blandon fled to the United States, where he started his own business. Sort of a import-export business. You know, he was importing a bunch of cocaine into the US and exporting a bunch of money back to the Contras. A lot of people didn't know about this until journalist Gary Webb wrote a series of articles for the San Jose Mercury News. He put out a 3-part series called Dark Alliance in 1996, which established connections between the CIA, the Contras, BCCI, and Panamanian dictator Manuel Noriega, and the crack epidemic. Ollie North himself called the series, quote, absolute garbage. And hey, if anyone's an expert on absolute garbage, it's the guy who illegally sold weapons to US enemies behind Congress's back to fund narco-terrorist groups. When Webb put out Dark Alliance in '96, it should have made his whole career, but instead, multiple news outlets made it their mission to discredit Webb's reporting, which ultimately led to the San Jose Mercury News pulling the series and firing him. Webb would then be blacklisted by pretty much every news outlet in the entire country. Okay, so let me give you guys a short and simple version. You can buy Dark Alliance as a book. I highly recommend you guys read it because it is absolutely nuts. Okay, so it goes like this. Manuel Noriega had pilots that would fly to Colombia and pick up cocaine from the Medellin cartel. The planes would then fly to northern Costa Rica to Contra-controlled airstrips. The planes would then drop off weapons for the Contras and refuel before heading to the United States and dropping off the cocaine. Shit, now that I think about it, my dad did say something about my Uncle Ruben taking a bunch of trips to Costa Rica in the late 80s. Probably unrelated though. On the West Coast, most of the coke went to Blandon, who in turn funneled the proceeds back to the Contras. Oh, and BCCI was helping launder money for all of these people. Webb also insinuates that it was impossible that the CIA and the DEA didn't know what was going on. Costa Rica was crawling with federal agents, and CIA spy planes were constantly monitoring the airspace on behalf of the Contras. He also mentioned that the CIA was stonewalling local law enforcement when they tried to investigate Blandon or Rick Ross or anybody else involved. Now, a lot of people believe that this actually went even further, that the CIA was actively protecting these drug peddlers for years and purposely caused the crack epidemic so that they could destabilize inner cities and target minorities with unfair drug laws and policing. But hey, that's just a theory. A conspiracy theory. That was... I don't know if I like that bit. I might cut that out. Dark Alliance was initially met with near universal acclaim. Gary probably thought that he was in the running for a Pulitzer, but that would be short-lived. It wouldn't be long before almost every prominent news outlet in the country would come for his neck. The LA Times in particular went especially hard. They gathered a team of 17 reporters to write a hit piece on Webb that was actually longer than Dark Alliance itself. In it, they dissected the articles and listed every single mistake or inaccuracy they could find to try and discredit him. Now, keep in mind, he was mostly right about everything. We know this in retrospect. Like, yeah, he might have used a lot of conjecture, may have made some inaccurate statements here and there, but for the most part, he was right. The San Jose Mercury News initially stuck by his side, but eventually they caved to the pressure and fired Gary. He was now a disgraced reporter, blacklisted from ever working as a journalist in the United States. Gary would later be found in his home with 2 shot wounds to the head. Now guys, I'm about to say something controversial. I think Gary actually did whack himself. I know. I had heard about this story before and I always thought it was obvious that the feds got him, but that happened 10 years after he got fired. Like, if they were gonna do it, I think they would have done it sooner, right? I mean, indirectly, yeah, sure, they helped ruin his reputation, which led to depression and ultimately his but I don't think a guy in a suit walked into his house and shot him in the face, you know? Like that would actually be especially considering the CIA has access to a variety of poisons and stuff that would be way more subtle than a bullet to the head. You know, this whole thing is kind of like that bell curve meme where like people on the left and right both think he didn't whack himself. Or at least that's what my CIA handler told me to say. 9/11, God, I hate talking about this. Reminds me of that tragedy. Also, YouTube doesn't like when I talk about it either, so I'm gonna go ahead and not talk about it. I will talk about it on Patreon though. You know, sorry to keep plugging it, but you know, link in description. This handsome mother sucker is Manuel Antonio Noriega. He was a dictator, human rights abuser, drug trafficker, CIA asset, and close personal friend of Bush Sr. Noriega ran Panama with an iron fist while at the same time being on the CIA's payroll. During his reign, Panama was known as a narco-kleptocracy, which is a cool way to say that he sold drugs and lived very large at the expense of his own people. At the same time, the guy helped the US government do a bunch of shady shit in Latin America, so the US largely looked away when it came to that other stuff, until eventually even they had enough of his shit, and Bush invaded Panama and overthrew him. He went through the classic CIA asset to brutal dictator to getting overthrown by the US pipeline. Noriega was recruited by the CIA while he was attending a US military academy, and he even received intelligence training from the Americans. In 1968, General Omar Torrijos Herrera took control of Panama in a coup. Noriega put his training to good use and cozied up to Torrijos, rapidly rising through the ranks and eventually being made the head of military intelligence. When Torrijos died in a helicopter crash in 1981, Noriega didn't waste any time in taking his spot. By 1983, he had complete control of Panama. During this time, there were a lot of communist revolutions springing up in Latin America, and Panama was seen by the US as a sort of bulwark against the Great Red Menace. Noriega basically allowed the US to use his country as a base for covert operations in the region. He would pass information to the CIA and help supply anti-communist groups like the Contras. He would even assassinate people if the need arose. In exchange, the US looked the other way when he did naughty things like trafficking tons of drugs into the US. You see, Noriega wasn't just working with the CIA, he was also working with guys like Pablo Escobar. In a few short years, Noriega made upwards of $1 billion in today's money from his drug smuggling enterprise. It was funny. At home, Ronald Reagan was ramping up the war on drugs.
Drugs are menacing our society. They're threatening our values and undercutting our institutions. They're killing our children. From the beginning of our administration, we've taken strong steps to do something about this horror.
He was supporting Noriega and the Contras, who were funneling tons of cocaine into the US, which is kind of like shitting in your friend's cereal bowl and then promising them that you'll hunt down and kill the man who just shit in their cereal, or something like that. I don't know. I failed analogy class in college. In the Gary Webb section, I already talked about the links between the Contras and Noriega, but Noriega had a much bigger role than just helping them smuggle drugs. Like, he also offered to sabotage or assassinate Sandinista leaders. Like, he was heavily involved with helping the Contras and several other anti-communist groups. By the late 1980s, the US's relationship with Noriega fell apart faster than my relationship with my Uncle Ruben when I found out he was sleeping with my ex-girlfriend. And it wasn't just because of the drug things either. The guy was genuinely batshit insane. He was really into witchcraft and even had a personal sorcerer who he used to curse his enemies. So it was becoming more and more clear that Noriega was more of a liability than an asset. That was made even more apparent when the US found out Noriega was selling US secrets to Cuba while on the CIA's payroll. Plus there was the stuff he was doing domestically, like beheading one of his political opponents. Things came to a head in 1990. When Noriega had completely canceled Panama's elections and declared himself maximum leader. But the man completely lost his marbles when he declared war on the United States. The US immediately responded by sending troops into Panama and bombing the shit out of the country. This was the biggest military action by the US since the Vietnam War, and they called the invasion Operation Just Cause, which is kind of badass, I can't even lie. Noriega went on the run. Disguised as a woman, he fled to Panama's Vatican embassy, where he would remain as a guest for the next few months. Now, the US military couldn't just storm the embassy, because that would be rude. Instead, they did something much much worse. They tried to drive Noriega insane by blasting loud American rock music 24 hours a day for 3 days straight. The playlist they used is actually available on YouTube if you guys want to check it out. A lot of the songs are bangers, I'm not even gonna lie. That ended after the Vatican called George Bush directly and begged him to stop this cruel and unusual torture. Eventually, Noriega was captured and sentenced to lengthy prison sentences in multiple countries for drug trafficking and crimes against humanity. The Syrian coup of 1949. The CIA had just been formed 2 years prior, and this was their first ever attempt at regime change. You know, historically, Syria cannot catch a break. In the early 20th century, they broke away from the Ottoman Empire only to become a French colony. In 1946, they were finally able to get their independence and held their first ever democratic elections. Shukri al-Quwatli became Syria's first president. But as the Cold War was kicking off, Syria became a real pain in the ass for the United States for a few reasons. They were friendly with the USSR. Secondly, they refused to sign an armistice with the newly formed Israel. And worst of all, they refused to let an oil pipeline from Saudi Arabia go through their territory. An oil pipeline owned by Chevron. So then the newly founded CIA came up with a plan, heeding a very simple principle. If you can't change the game, change the players. Al-Shukri had to go, but first they had to find someone to replace him. Someone who was not only power hungry, but also willing to make an unpopular decision on behalf of the US. They landed on Hosni al-Zaim, the commander of the Syrian army. Now, the level of the CIA's involvement is unknown, but what I do know is that on March 29th, 1949, al-Zaim's forces marched into Damascus in the dead of night. The military occupied the parliament building, police headquarters, and the residence of the prime minister. And finally, the president himself. Telephone lines were cut and the borders were shut down. The prime minister was arrested and exiled to Egypt. Al-Zaim immediately agreed to do everything the US asked. He would ban communists from the government, allow the oil pipeline to be built, and he even signed a peace deal with Israel. But unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, none of this stuff actually came to be. Al-Zaim was only in power for 137 days before getting couped himself by one of his own colonels. He was then executed via firing squad. The guy who took his spot, Sami Hawani, did the most horrible thing imaginable. He promised to restore democracy in Syria. Hinawi was also a nationalist who undid all of the stuff Al-Zaim did for the US. The CIA realized they had majorly screwed up by not providing more support to Al-Zaim, so they had to course correct. In December, just 1 month after Hinawi took power, he was ousted by another CIA-backed military coup and replaced by Adib Shishraki. Oh, by the way, this guy would also be assassinated a few years later. Man, Syria really got dealt a bad hand. And there's only one man who can save it. In the 60s, Brazil was in the midst of a severe political crisis. Jânio Quadros took office in January of 1961. By August of that year, he unexpectedly resigned. Literally no one was expecting this. No one. In his resignation letter, Portuguese, they don't pronounce their J's like that. I think it's Jânio. In his resignation letter, Jânio cited occult forces as one of the reasons.
That's what this is, you know. Satanic black magic. Sick shit.
In reality, though, this was likely a galaxy brain political move. See, Quadros was getting irritated by all the political factions in Brazilian Congress, so he figured that if he randomly resigned, they would beg him to stay in office so he could consolidate power. But this move ended up backfiring spectacularly when Congress immediately accepted his resignation. The guy had underestimated the amount of ops who wanted him gone. So Quadros was now out of office, and there was a massive dispute over who should take his place. A lot of people in the military wanted this guy, João Goulart, popularly nicknamed Django. But others in the military were against him due to his supposed ties to communism. The US government started throwing money at opposition parties trying to weaken Django ahead of the presidential election in 1965. They founded media conglomerates to paint Django as a puppet of the USSR. Now here's a fun fact for you. In 1965, the US government spent more on Brazil's elections than on the US presidential election. But it didn't matter. The US could throw infinity money at the opposition. Django was just that popular. The guy had a cool ass name. How could he not win? the US was freaking out that the largest country in South America might become communist. And just to be clear though, the guy was not a communist. He was just like kind of neutral, and he had a few friends who were leftists. That's it. It wasn't like he was out there quoting Karl Marx or anything. But you know what they say, if you can't beat him, coup him. The CIA had infiltrated Brazil's war college and started training officers to overthrow the government. Meanwhile, in Langley, Virginia, the CIA was drawing up plans to send in a covert military force to help on the ground. But it ended up not being necessary. The Brazilian military carried out a coup on their own. General Humberto Branco ended the Fourth Brazilian Republic and created a military dictatorship that lasted until 1985. In the initial years, this was the US's wet dream. He launched Operation Cleanup, aimed at removing every labor union in the country. And, you know, despite the initial chaos, the new government was actually able to stabilize Brazil's economy, largely because of the US's overt endorsement. They received a ton of foreign investment and direct funding from the US, which created an economic boom that lasted for a little while, till it didn't. Similarly to his older brother, Robert F. Kennedy's assassination has been the subject of many conspiracy theories. Not as much, but still a decent amount. Now, this is the official story. In 1968, Kennedy was running for president. He was one of the frontrunners for the Democratic nomination. On June 5th, Kennedy was celebrating winning the California primary, which was huge. RFK was giving a victory speech to his supporters in front of the Ambassador Hotel in LA. But unfortunately, the celebration was cut short by a gunshot to the head. The shooter was Sirhan Sirhan, a Palestinian man who wasn't a fan of RFK's support of Israel, which is kind of weird because Kennedy wasn't even like the most diehard Israel supporter. So a lot of people thought it was strange that he would specifically be targeted when most of our politicians were getting AIPAC money, and still are. At first, Sirhan said that he felt bad about whacking Kennedy and that it wasn't personal and he just felt like he was helping the Palestinian people. But later, he claimed to have no recollection of the assassination at all, which led others to believe that he might have been a Manchurian candidate. So we know that the CIA experimented with mind control. We know that they were trying to create a Manchurian candidate. So the idea is that Sirhan was hypnotized into whacking Kennedy, and this isn't just some schizos on the internet who believe this, by the way. Like, his own lawyers argued this in court. In 2018, Sirhan was visited in prison by Donald Trump's health secretary, Robert Kennedy Jr. After a 3-hour-long conversation, RFK-J said he was convinced that there was a second gunman and that Sirhan was just a distraction. So that's like the other theory. The motivation is the same as with JFK, like the CIA didn't like him, they wanted to get rid of him. Anyways, RIP Bobby, you would have loved watching Kai Cenat.
Suck that nigga till he 10 times. That nigga all night.
In 2011, the Syrian civil war broke out, and several factions were trying to overthrow this guy. Listen, I know that the CIA asked me to speak out against him, but I can't do it. I cannot do it, okay? Nothing you can say to me will make me hate this beautiful man. Timber Sycamore was a secret program launched by Obama where the CIA provided weapons and training for Syrian rebels. Now, this is probably the worst thing that Obama has ever done. Well, other than wearing that tan suit, the fuck were you thinking, man? Oh, also like the bailouts for the banks and the drone striking a shit ton of civilians. But this is worse than all that, and I'll tell you why. If you drop a metric fuck ton of weapons into a war zone where literally dozens of factions are vying for power, naturally, some of those weapons are going to end up in the hands of people who maybe we don't like very much. Now, there was a very complicated web of factions involved in this war. Look at this graph, man. This shit is more confusing than a woman's reproductive system. You got Iranian-backed militias, Russian mercenaries, Kurdish freedom fighters, US-backed militias, and extremist jihadi groups. A significant portion of weapons ended up in the hands of the latter, specifically an Al-Qaeda affiliate called Al-Nusra. And even worse, ISIS. You guys remember them? They're still around, by the way. Ironically, ISIS was created as a result of the US invasion of Iraq. Using the chaos of the Civil War and their new supply of US weapons, ISIS was able to make rapid territorial gains. In January of 2014, they captured the Syrian city of Raqqa, which became the capital of their caliphate. So the US had to shift from fighting Assad to fighting another much worse enemy, which we created. Now, ISIS was so evil that most of the sides of the Civil War took a break from fighting each other to focus on them. Do you know how bad you have to be to get Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, and the US on the same side? That's like getting me, my ex-wife, my Uncle Reuben, Franklin the Turtle, and Hitler on the same side. Now, the Syrian Civil War and the fight against ISIS caused hundreds of thousands of deaths, mass displacement, a refugee crisis, and irreparable instability in the region. Hey, at least Raytheon and Lockheed Martin shareholders got some sick returns. Bangkok. Why would you name your city that? Despite its name, this has nothing to do with Thailand. The Bangkok plot was an attempt to overthrow the Prince of Cambodia in the 1950s. Prince Norodom Sihanouk, probably not saying that right, was able to secure Cambodia's independence from France. So he was popular. In 1955, he abdicated the throne and became a politician. His party dominated parliament, and he easily became prime minister, which actually gave him more power than when he was prince. So this is where the problems started to arise. Sihanouk wasn't a rabid anti-communist. Now, this isn't to say he was a communist by any means. He just wanted to stay neutral, which to Allen Dulles and Dwight Eisenhower was as bad as being a full-on Marxist. So the CIA, along with Thailand and South Vietnam, financially backed a bunch of right-wing nationalists and encouraged them to start a coup. They meticulously planned how they were going to overthrow the government, and in 1959, it was finally go time. But Sihanouk got word of the plot and crushed it before it even started. Ironically, this led to him getting closer with Mao's China, since clearly he couldn't trust the West. Many such cases, by the way. In fact, Western aggression against this guy led to Pol Pot taking over Cambodia, who was literally the most murderous genocidal dictator in history, or at least like top 3. Albanians. Are they even human? The jury's still out on that one. During pretty much the entire Cold War, Albania was ran by this guy, Enver Hoxha. I made a video about him too if you're interested. Also, I know it's actually pronounced Hoxha, I just think rage baiting Albanians is funny.
Shut up before I grandma twice.
Now, when he first took over Albania, Hoxha was pretty popular both domestically and abroad, as is often the case, but as the years went on, bro started to lose his mind. Hoxha pioneered a new type of political ideology, which I like to call schizo-communism. He was such a fundamentalist that he thought every other communist country was doing it wrong. So one by one, he cut ties, first with Yugoslavia, then with the USSR, and finally with China. His domestic policy was also completely dog-brained, fearing an imminent invasion from Yugoslavia or Russia or the US or aliens. Hoxha had 750,000 bunkers built across Albania. He also stockpiled tons of weapons and ammunition, while his people starved to death. Now, to be fair, his paranoia wasn't completely unfounded, because for 10 years, the CIA, along with British and French intelligence, tried to overthrow him. The West was hoping to deny the Soviets access to the Mediterranean and also gain a foothold in the Balkans that they could launch operations from. The plan was to infiltrate Albania with anti-communist exiles that would build a covert resistance network made mostly of ex-Nazis and also Zoglodites, which is the name I gave to supporters of the exiled King Zog. Just a little sidebar about King Zog. This guy was absolutely goated. He smoked 200 cigarettes a day and survived 55 assassination attempts. No idea how he was as a ruler, but either way, the British wanted him back on the throne. But the only problem is, all of the agents they sent kept dying. About 200 trained insurgents were killed over the course of 3 years. Well, it turns out MI6 had a mole. A guy by the name of Kim Philby was secretly working for the Soviets and passing information on to them, who tipped off Hoxha's people. So yeah, this plan was a massive failure and only contributed to Hoxha's growing paranoia that foreign powers wanted to take over his nation, because I mean, they did. That being said, the guy was a complete jerk. Okay, normally I'm not a fan of CIA-backed regime change, or at least I wasn't prior to being locked in this room and forced to make this video. But I think this is one of the rare cases where it would have been almost impossible to get a worse leader than him, than Hoxha. This guy might be the only dictator with no fans. MK Naomi was a biological warfare research program that ran in the 1950s. It mostly involved coming up with new ways to poison people, but they also researched potential bioweapons that could be used on a large population. One project involved spraying the entire city of San Francisco with a quote-unquote harmless but traceable bacteria. Mostly harmless would have been a better phrase, because one person did die and several others contracted UTIs. The researchers who sprayed the bacteria concluded that San Francisco was vulnerable to a biological warfare attack, which is like, I don't really understand this. This is like if I threw shit at someone's face and was like, yeah, well, it looks like this guy is very vulnerable to getting shit thrown in his face. So MKUltra basically had 3 stages. It started out as Project Bluebird, then the second iteration was Artichoke, before it finally became MKUltra. In 1951, Alan Dulles wanted to expand Bluebird and gave it a new name. Apparently, he picked Artichoke because that was his favorite vegetable, and if that doesn't tell you everything you need to know about this psychopath, I don't know what else to say, bro. Like, artichoke is your favorite vegetable? What the fuck? Operation Condor was a secret alliance between a bunch of South American military dictators headed by Chile's Pinochet. The group also included Argentina, Paraguay, Brazil, and many more. The goal of the group was to suppress leftist opposition and perceived communist threats through intelligence sharing, assassination, kidnapping, and torture. A lot of these operations were supported and financed by US intelligence. In 1992, a collection of documents, now called the Archives of Terror, were discovered, proving the existence of Condor and the extent of the tomfoolery. They show that around 50,000 people were killed, 30,000 displaced, and 400,000 imprisoned over the course of Condor. Rafael Trujillo, this guy was famous for changing the names of everything to his own name. Like, he changed the city's capital to Trujillo City and then changed the name of the streets to some variation of Trujillo, which confused the absolute shit out of anyone who owned a car. He was also a prolific chubby chaser, apparently, and he made his son a colonel in the army. His 4-year-old son. Hey, this guy sounds like a funny, eccentric guy. I hope he didn't commit mass murder. Oh. So this man was not right mentally, obviously. He wasn't very well liked in Washington either, but he was a fervent anti-communist, so we put up with him. However, starting in 1959, the US's stance on Trujillo began to shift after Castro overthrew the Batista government in Cuba. You see, the CIA warned Eisenhower that the Dominican people rightfully hated Trujillo, so it was only a matter of time until he got overthrown. The big fear was that Trujillo would be replaced with a Castro-esque communist revolutionary, which obviously they couldn't have. The CIA started putting a plan in motion to replace Trujillo with another anti-communist guy. So they got in contact with some of Trujillo's ops and smuggled some weapons in for them. On May 30th, 1961, Trujillo was leaving the house of one of his Rubenesque girlfriends and headed back to Trujillo City. On the way back, his car was intercepted by a group of 8 armed men who proceeded to shoot his ass. The weapons they used were later found to have been smuggled through the US Embassy. This should have been a huge win, except it ended up backfiring completely because the guy who took Trujillo's place was kind of a socialist. Whoops. Here's a fun fact. Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the entire world. In 1998, Venezuela elected Hugo Chavez as president. As soon as he entered office, he asked Congress for special emergency powers so that he could rip the Venezuelan constitution out by the roots to save the country. Basically, he spent a lot of that oil money on social programs. So the United States quickly branded him a leftist dictator in the making, which, I mean, I guess, yeah. The following year, people got to vote on a brand new constitution, which expanded presidential powers, extended presidential terms to 6 years, and centralized the two chambers of parliament into one. At the time, this made him even more popular, and he was re-elected under the new constitution with like 60% of the vote. But this popular support had some gaps. A lot of people weren't thrilled with Hugo's increasingly dictatorial behavior, so they started protesting. But even more serious than the problems at home were the growing tensions with the United States. Chavez was the only leader in the Americas who didn't sign George Bush's free trade agreement. He also got a little too close with Fidel Castro there. But in 2001, he took things way too far when he condemned the US bombing of civilians in Afghanistan. So the NED, a civilian subsidiary of the CIA, started sending hundreds of thousands of dollars to opposition groups in Venezuela. Now, since Venezuela is a petro-state, their entire economy is based on their oil reserves. Their state-owned oil company, the PDVSA, provided funding for, well, everything. Chavez used the profits from the PDVSA to fund all of his social programs, and starting in 2002, the company leadership started to break away from Chavez and supported the ongoing protests against him, which really pissed him off. Chavez went on TV and announced that he was firing everybody involved. This, in turn, riled up the protesters even more, and a massive mob descended on Venezuela's capital city. To make matters worse, members of the Venezuelan military had turned on Chavez and asked him to step down. 1 million people marched on the presidential palace. Pro-Chavez counter-protesters also started gathering, and violent clashes broke out between the two groups, leaving 18 people dead. Chavez was then arrested and taken to a military prison. The leader of the opposition, Pedro Carmona, would then become Venezuela's interim president. The first thing he did was suspend Venezuela's Congress, Supreme Court, and Constitution. Now, Carmona would go on to reign in Venezuela for the extremely long period of 48 hours. Yeah, the guy was in office 2 days before pro-Chavez demonstrators stormed the presidential palace. Chavez also had supporters in the military, and didn't take long for them to overturn the coup and put him back in power. Now, again, I can't say to what extent the CIA was involved with this coup. The Bush administration denies any involvement. The only thing I know for sure is that they knew it was going to happen beforehand. Thankfully, this would be the last coup attempt. Oh, fuck. This is probably the funniest, most ridiculous attempt at a coup I've ever heard about. This right here is Nicolás Maduro, alleged president of Venezuela who took power in 2013 after the death of Hugo Chavez. Now, I'm saying alleged because we, the United States, do not recognize him. Now, I'm not gonna lie, Maduro is kind of a huge jerk, but no one hates him as much as the United States of America, who recognized Juan Guaido as the rightful leader of Venezuela. In 2020, President Donald Trump issued a $15 million bounty on him, claiming that he is a narco-terrorist or some shit. Now, the bounty was basically like Gold Roger talking about the One Piece.
You want my treasure? You can have it.
Mercenaries from all over the world wanted to collect that sweet, sweet cash prize. But none more than this guy, Jordan Goudreau, former Green Beret and current head of Silver Corps, a private mercenary group. On May 3rd, 2020, Jordan launched one of the most idiotic, limp-dicked coup attempts in history. One person said it made the Bay of Pigs look like D-Day. Here was the plan. 2 American mercenaries, along with about 60 Venezuelans, would launch an amphibious assault from Colombia. Once they landed, the group would split off. One unit would capture a nearby radio station and activate anti-Maduro sleeper cells scattered around the country. The 2 Americans would take over the airport, and the final unit would arrest Maduro himself. Afterwards, he would be taken back to the United States and face justice. And Jordan could collect the bounty as well as a bunch of other funding that he got from random people to do this thing. But everything immediately went to shit. First of all, Jordan's boat broke down, so he was stuck in Florida. He had to lead the troops via radio. But hey, that's okay, you know, it's not impossible, you know, he doesn't have to physically be there, I guess. But then another problem came up. The terrible weather made getting to Venezuela a nightmare. The men got seasick and started throwing up. Jordan tried telling them to go back to Colombia so they could reschedule, but they misunderstood and kept going on as planned, which turned out to be a terrible mistake because one of the boats ran out of fuel and was spotted by a Venezuelan fishing boat. The fishermen contacted the Coast Guard, who immediately swarmed the boats, killing 8 Venezuelans and capturing the 2 American mercenaries. Damn, dude, no wonder Trump hates these fishing boats so much. Believe it or not, Gideon, which is the name given to this operation, gets even stupider. Turns out the whole operation had been infiltrated by Maduro the whole time. He knew it was gonna happen. He knew where they were gonna land. He knew pretty much everything about it. But it's not like Jordan was trying to keep it secret. You know, the schmuck literally tweeted about it as it was going down. Okay, this is a literal tweet that he put out. Dude, how is this an actual historical event that happened? Okay, so where does the CIA factor into all this? Well, one of the main guys involved in the coup, other than Goudreau, was this guy Cliver Alcala, who later claimed that Jordan was in the CIA and that multiple intelligence agencies were aware that it was gonna go down. And he wasn't the only one making these claims. But I highly doubt that's the case because the CIA apparently tried to warn Jordan not to go through with it on multiple occasions. Even they were like, bro, you seriously need to relax. Around 1967, Lyndon Jumbo Johnson was getting a little worried about the anti-war sentiment brewing in the United States. He feared that these protests could snowball into a full-blown revolution. So instead of, oh, I don't know, ending the Vietnam War, he decided to set up a domestic surveillance program to illegally spy on American citizens. Johnson tapped the FBI and CIA, who each set up their own ops. The CIA's operation was codenamed Chaos, focused mostly on infiltrating the hippie movement. Chaos pretty much had 2 goals. 1, establish a link between anti-war groups and communist governments. 2, destroy said groups from the inside. So yeah, the CIA basically had a bunch of agents pretending to be hippies. So these guys' whole job was to do drugs and have intercourse with hippies all day, and occasionally report back some intel to the feds. Under Nixon, the scope of the operation would grow because Nixon famously really hated hippies. Erkan Alpkin is a Uyghur nationalist who advocates for an independent Uyghur nation. If you guys are unfamiliar with the Uyghurs, they are white people who act like black. I'm kidding, they're a primarily Muslim ethnic group found in China. The CCP has been accused of widespread persecution against them, forced labor, cultural erasure, and straight up internment camps. Now, this Erkan guy is the president of the World Uyghur Congress, which has been called, quote, a US-backed right-wing regime change network seeking the fall of China. Now, Erkan did work for Radio Free Europe at one point, which we know was backed by the CIA, so people kind of use that as proof that he still works for the CIA in some capacity. I don't know, man. Honestly, between the Chinese and US propaganda, it's hard to know what the hell is true. I hate to be the both sides guy, but like, all these people are retarded. On March 8th, 1985, a van filled with 400 pounds of explosives detonated in Beirut's southern suburbs, killing 80 civilians and injuring 200. Most of them were women attending a nearby mosque. Now, the intended target of this explosion was Mohammed Hussein Fadlallah, a Shia cleric with ties to Hezbollah. The bomb killed pretty much everyone except him. Ah yes, the Israeli strategy. Surprisingly, though, Israel actually wasn't involved in this, or at least not that I can find. You know who was involved, though? Saudi Arabia. Oh, what, you thought I was gonna say the CIA? Well, guys, luckily, the House Intelligence Committee found that the CIA was not involved in this unfortunate event. I mean, yes, the group that carried out the attack was funded and trained by the CIA, but come on, guys, come on. And yes, it is possible that this bombing was a retaliation for a previous bombing done by Hezbollah that killed US soldiers.
The official toll now tops 160 dead and more than 180 wounded. The list of survivors, dead and wounded, is still being compiled. but the disaster is by far the worst since the Marines have been in Lebanon.
Now, the CIA admits that these people were involved with the CIA, but that the bombing was carried out without authorization. All right? Case closed. Bob Woodward, the guy who broke the Watergate scandal, said that he interviewed William Casey, the CIA director at the time, on his deathbed, and Casey admitted that the CIA was involved in the attack. I don't know how credible that is, a deathbed confession, but, you know, just putting the information out there, I guess. Angola. It's a country in Africa, specifically right here. Also, they have a cool flag with a machete on it. This was the location of a 2 decades-long proxy war. On one side, you had the anti-communist faction called UNITA, and on the other side, you had the MPLA. UNITA was backed mainly by the US and South Africa, but also a bunch of random-ass countries like Bulgaria, Egypt, Morocco, and weirdly enough, China. The other team had an even longer list of supporters, including the Soviet Union, Algeria, Romania, Somalia, and weirdly enough, China. Apparently, after the Chinese-Soviet split, China wanted to piss off Russia by any means necessary, so they kind of switched sides. Honestly, kind of based. I'm a huge fan of switching sides. You know, sometimes I'll switch sides mid-conversation. Now, one key player I forgot to mention was Cuba, who actually sent their own military to aid the MPLA. The US publicly denounced the USSR and Cuba for getting involved in Angola. Meanwhile, they were sending UNITA and other groups tens of millions of dollars plus weapons through US ally Mobutu Sese Seko. In the end, it didn't matter because the communists won, so we spent all that money for nothing. In the early 2000s, I'm gonna move a little bit closer. In the early 2000s, the US became increasingly worried about Iran getting their hands on a nuclear weapon. The Clinton administration was desperate to get some intel on Iran's nuclear program, but that was shut tighter than I want to say a clam? Some sort? I don't know. Again, bad at analogies. The only thing that we know for sure was that we absolutely did not want Iran getting their hands on a nuke under any circumstances. That's when the boys at Langley devised a brilliant plan. Let's give Iran the blueprints to build a nuke. Wait, what? Yes, the CIA literally gave nuclear weapon plans to Iran in what has been called one of the most reckless operations in the modern history of the CIA, one that may have helped put nuclear weapons in the hands of a member of what George Bush has called the axis of evil. So here was the plan. The CIA recruited this Russian scientist guy who had previously worked on the Soviet nuclear program. His assignment was to pose as a greedy scientist willing to sell nuclear secrets to the highest bidder. But here was the catch. The blueprints included a bunch of flaws. The CIA thought that the Iranians wouldn't notice the flaws and would build a nuke based on those designs. When the time came to test the nuclear boy, instead of being met with a big, beautiful mushroom cloud, they would be greeted with the nuclear equivalent of a wet fart. I bit my tongue again. This humiliating setback would delay Iran's ability to get a nuke by at least several more years. But in the end, the only ones getting humiliated was the boys at the CIA. The flaws built into the plans were meant to be so clever and so well hidden that nobody would notice. But the Russian agent immediately noticed. So what did he do? He included a letter along with the blueprints telling the Iranians that there were flaws and that he could help them fix them. Why did he do this? Question mark? Well, the CIA didn't tell this guy shit. He had no idea why they wanted to give these plans to the Iranians. He had no idea why there were mistakes in them, and he assumed that the feds were trying to f him over somehow. Also, he figured that the Iranians would find the flaws anyways, since it took him like 2 seconds, so he wanted to hedge his bets just in case. In the end, not only did we not get any additional insight on the Iranian nuclear weapons program, we also probably helped accelerate it by providing them with plans for an atomic bomb. So I got pretty much all of the information about this from this book, State of War by James Risen. Again, check it out. The Onion Router, or Tor, is the main way people access the dark web. Honestly, I tried to understand how Tor works, but I'm not autistic enough. All I know is that it makes it harder to track your internet activity. Speaking of which, you guys should protect your data using a VPN. Oh shit, wait, I don't have an ad here. That was just reflex. I'm gay. Also, Tor was originally invented by the Navy to be used by the CIA and other intelligence agencies. The FBI and CIA also have a bunch of honeypot sites that they use to lure people into doing something illegal so they can arrest them. Apparently, the dark web is no longer safe for criminals these days, or at least that's according to this headline of this article, which I didn't really bother to read. That means that criminals now have to go on the darker web to do their illegal activities. In 1958, a lot of stuff was going down in the Middle East. This guy, Abdul al-Karim Qasim, overthrew the Iraqi Hashemite monarchy. Qasim, by the way, this guy's name is so long, like there's like 23 words. Anyways, Qasim became the new de facto ruler of Iraq, and over the next few years, he did all of the things we know pisses off the United States. First of all, they reached out to the Soviet Union and were somewhat friendly with them. Secondly, they nationalized their oil, which deprived the United States. To top it all off, Qasim explicitly allied himself with the Iraqi Communist Party. In 1959, they withdrew from the Baghdad Pact, a Middle Eastern version of NATO, instead signing a defensive agreement with the USSR. The CIA director at the time called Iraq the most dangerous spot on the globe. The same year, the US National Security Advisor assured everyone that they would do everything in their power to prevent a full communist takeover of Iraq. But all the information we have kind of stops here. We don't really know to what extent the CIA was involved in the events that are about to come up. But what we do know is that the CIA had spies embedded in the local leadership structure. So they were getting first-hand accounts of everything that was going on there. They also were very public about their plans to overthrow Qasim. But again, the proposals are all we have. We don't actually know what they did or if they did anything at all. Over the next few years, Qasim, or is it Qasim? Or is it Chasm? Over the next few years, Qasim slowly alienated a lot of the same people who helped put him in power, including the Ba'ath Party, which had been targeted by a wave of arrests. The Ba'athis were led by Colonel Abdul Karim Mustafa. In 1963, he launched a coup against the government and toppled Qasim and later killed him. This was great news for the US, who immediately recognized Mustafa and started normalizing relations with Iraq again. The Ba'ath Party then cracked down on communists, executing around 1,500 people with communist ties. Allegedly, the CIA supplied the Iraqi Foreign Ministry with a lot of names of people they wanted to get rid of. But again, hard to say if that's true. Now, I should mention that the most famous member of the Ba'ath Party was Saddam Hussein, the same Saddam Hussein who would go on to be public enemy number one for the US. Once again, many such cases. Operation Cyclone. I'm not sure why this one is so far down. There was an entire movie made about it. Charlie Wilson's War. Great film, complete propaganda fluff piece, but still good nonetheless. In 1978, a communist government took power in Afghanistan. They did some chill stuff like giving women rights and banning child marriage. They did some not so chill stuff like enforced secularism and mass executing clerics. A lot of people did not like this, so an Islamist uprising broke out, and the USSR responded by invading Afghanistan to back up their communist buddies. The US saw this as an opportunity to bog the Soviet Union down, just like they were bogged down in Vietnam. That's how Operation Cyclone was born. The longest and most expensive CIA operation in history. Like, it literally holds a Guinness Book of World Records record. The US, along with a bunch of other countries, started covertly funneling a shit ton of arms and money to the Mujahideen, a coalition of Muslim freedom fighters. The CIA also helped train a lot of these Mujahideen groups. And these Mujahideen, there were some great people among them. One of them was Osama bin Laden of Al-Qaeda fame. There was also Mullah Omar, the founder of the Taliban. Great guys. I don't see how this could possibly end badly. After the Soviet Union pulled out, some of the Mujahideen troops started fighting each other in a series of civil wars that lasted until 1996, when the Taliban eventually won and took control of the country. Luckily, it's been nothing but smooth sailing since then. In the 1980s, Libya was the dominant power in Africa. Their ruler, Giga Chad Gaddafi, wasn't too friendly towards the US. Unfortunately for the CIA, at the time Gaddafi was far too secure in power to topple, so they decided to go for the next best thing. Speaking of Chads, Libya was in the middle of a war with its southern neighbor, Chad. Apart from the war with Libya, Chad also had a lot of domestic turmoil with multiple rebel groups operating in it. This made it fertile ground for a good old-fashioned coup. If the US couldn't overthrow Libya, they could at least use Chad to destabilize Gaddafi's regime. But first, the United States needed a guy, which eventually they found. This guy, Hissène Habré. He was the perfect candidate, a Chadian nationalist through and through. Didn't like communism, and he would do anything to fight off Libyan aggression. Now, our perfect guy also happened to be a complete psychopath whose most famous endeavors included kidnapping a French anthropologist and having a mass grave next to his house filled with his enemies. The CIA thought this was a charming fella, so they provided him with millions of dollars in funding. In June of 1982, he successfully seized power and became the de facto leader of Chad. As far as African dictators go, Habré was pretty standard fare. His rule was marked by political execution, mass arrests, ethnic cleansing, you know, the classics. The specific number of deaths isn't concrete, but estimates put it as high as 40,000, maybe even more. In one particularly brutal incident, Habré negotiated with some rebels from southern Chad and invited them to a reconciliation ceremony. They showed up to pay their respects. Habré had them all executed, and to top it all off, he also ran a sex slave ring. Okay, you know what? Maybe this guy was worse than the typical African dictator. Now, to be fair, the full extent of his crimes weren't known until after his rule ended, but even when it was still ongoing, people knew he was up to no good. Despite that, the US continued to provide him with a significant amount of material support and even sent liaisons from the CIA to advise him. Actually, it was a little bit more than an advisory role. Chad had a bunch of Libyan POWs because of the war. The US recruited them to create an army of counter-revolutionaries to oppose Gaddafi back home. Plus, you know, interrogation and all that. In 1990, Habré was finally deposed by another insurrection and fled to Senegal. Despite his numerous crimes, he didn't get a trial until 2015. He was finally sentenced to life in prison by the Senegalese government in 2016. From 1979 to 1992, El Salvador was embroiled in a brutal civil war. On one side, you got the government of El Salvador, a military junta backed by the United States. On the other, the FMLN, a left-wing guerrilla faction backed by Cuba and the USSR. To counter the FMLN, the government sponsored a bunch of right-wing paramilitary groups known as death squads. And they did exactly what their name sounds like. These squads would rove around the country murdering anyone suspected of aiding and abetting the FMLN, and it was brutal. If these guys heard there was a member of the FMLN in a village, they would roll up and massacre everyone. Men, women, children, priests, didn't matter. It's estimated that 75,000 people were slaughtered by these groups. And keep in mind, El Salvador is like a tiny country. Craziest thing is most of them probably didn't even have much to do with the FMLN. Now, the most infamous of these murders was that of El Salvador's Catholic Archbishop. The US initially blamed his assassination on the FMLN, but that didn't make any sense as he was an outspoken critic of the death squads. A now declassified CIA document shows that they knew exactly who was behind it and kept their mouths shut to not hurt their anti-communist war effort. Now, the Reagan administration funded these death squads to the tune of millions of dollars. The CIA themselves claimed that they had no involvement in their actions, but they were at the very least kind of involved. A lot of these paramilitary soldiers were trained by the CIA in the arts of interrogation, intelligence gathering, and counterinsurgency. It was alleged that one of the top generals in these death squads was in regular contact with the agency. While we're on the topic of paramilitary death squads, let's talk about the Phoenix program. For this one, we're gonna leave Central America and go to Vietnam. The Phoenix program was the codename for a counterinsurgency force that has been described as a civilian assassination program. So just to give you a little context on how fucked this was, the CIA director at the time, William Casey, had this to say.
The Phoenix program was developed to bring some order,
But during the mid-1960s, there was a great deal of anarchy and confusion. A large number of activities that went on there are quite frankly reprehensible. Yeah, you can say that again. So, Communist North Vietnam had a paramilitary group that had the goal of spreading communism to the south. They were known as the National Front for the Liberation of South Vietnam, better known as the Viet Cong. For some reason, a lot of these Viet Cong guys were named Charlie, which kind of weird, it doesn't sound like a very Vietnamese name. The Viet Cong were probably one of the most successful guerrilla forces in history. They were a real thorn in the side of the US. I mean, they were mostly like semi-literate, malnourished peasants, and they were making the most well-trained, well-armed, well-funded military in the world eat shit sandwiches for years. In addition to its paramilitary wing, the Viet Cong also had a non-military political/intelligence wing called the VCI. The main thing that the VCI did was infiltrate rural villages in South Vietnam to try and spread communist influence. They did this either by convincing the local leaders to join their side or by, old-fashioned kidnapping and murdering, and then replacing them with someone more friendly. The Phoenix program was a direct response to VCI activity in the South. Unfortunately, the whole thing ended up turning into a complete shit show. So here's how the Phoenix program, or PP, as I'll refer to it from now on, was set up. First, you had these things called PRUs.
Provincial Reconnaissance Unit.
These were essentially gangs that would run around killing and capturing VCI members. Then the second part was the Regional Interrogation Centers. This is where CIA-trained interrogators would torture captured VCI prisoners for information which would then be used by the PRUs to kill and capture more people, and the cycle continued on and on like this. So what ended up happening was that they were just killing and torturing a bunch of civilians. Apparently, the motto of the interrogation centers was, quote, "If they are innocent, beat them until they become guilty." Which is, yeah. After being subjected to increasingly brutal interrogation methods, a lot of these people would just give random names to make the torture stop. And when I say brutal, I am not being cute. K. Barton Osborne, a military intelligence officer during Vietnam, claims he saw the insertion of a 6-inch rod into the ear of one of the detainees, which was tapped through into the brain until dead. He also saw starvation and electronic shocks to both women's vaginas and men's cocks. Now, keep in mind, Osborne was accused of exaggerating, but I mean, pretty clear that they were definitely torturing people. It's just the extent of the torture that's debated. What's not debated, though, is that 26,000 people were killed as a result of the Phoenix program, most of them civilians. Klaus Barbie. Despite his name, this man was not a hot blonde with no genitals. In fact, he was the exact opposite. Klaus Barbie was also known as the Butcher of Lyon. Now, you don't get a name like that unless you butcher a bunch of people in Lyon, which is exactly what he did. I'm sorry, guys. I ran out of budget to pay a writer, so I had to hire some guy from Moldova to finish my script. Klaus was an SS officer and Gestapo chief in Nazi-occupied France. He personally oversaw the torture and deportation of 14,000 French resistance members and Jews to concentration camps. Now, you're probably thinking, a guy like that deserves to be shot in the face. But instead, he was recruited by the US as a counterintelligence asset against the communists. Now, the main reason the US wanted to recruit this guy was so that he could share classified British interrogation techniques with them. Klaus had personally been on the receiving end of said techniques, and I guess it was super valuable to the CIC.
Counterintelligence Corps.
I mean, they could have just, asked the British? Weren't we allies? Did they even try to ask before recruiting a mass murdering psychopath? Klaus was more than happy to share these techniques, and we found other uses for him as well. By the late 40s, Barbie was living in West Germany and spying on French intelligence, which the US suspected of being in bed with the Russians. And apparently, he was a really good asset and provided the CIC with a ton of intel. But in 1948, the French had discovered that Barbie was hiding out somewhere in Germany and was working with the US. Now, Obviously, they were not fans of this guy, and they issued a kill-on-sight order on him. When they heard that the US knew where he was, they requested him to be returned to France so that he could be turned into a stain on the floor. But instead of returning him, the CIC was just like, we have no idea where he is, and then smuggled him out of Europe into Bolivia. Klaus Altman, as he was now known, kept himself busy in Bolivia, getting involved with Pablo Escobar's Medellin cartel. He somehow also ended up working for Barrientos, the dictator of Bolivia who I mentioned earlier. He trained the Bolivian military in the art of torture and helped the government identify and stomp out any leftist movements. And the whole time he was sending intel to the CIA. And Barrientos was not the only dictator that Barbie worked with. In 1971, after Barrientos died in a helicopter crash and was replaced with a leader that was a little bit too friendly with communists, the US staged a coup with Klaus Barbie's help. Bolivia's next leader, Hugo Banzer Suarez, was a personal friend of Klaus's. He was a rabid anti-communist who brutally cracked down on political opponents. The torture, disappearances, and murders would reach a fever pitch during his reign. For his role in the coup, Barbie was rewarded the position of colonel in the new regime. But the same year, Klaus would run into some trouble. Turns out that his cover had been blown. In 1971, 2 Nazi hunters were tipped off that Klaus Altman was actually Barbie. So they flew to South America with a French journalist and eventually found Barbie. Now, I should mention that this journalist, Ladislas de Hoyos, was fluent in Spanish, German, and French. This is going to be important later. So Ladislas asked Barbie for an interview, which for some reason he actually agreed to. In the interview, he completely denied being Klaus Barbie and said that he only spoke Spanish. But the interviewer trapped him.
Le journaliste français prend son courage à deux mains. Sans prévenir et à l'encontre des règles imposées par les officiers du ministère, il demande, cette fois-ci en français,
N'êtes-vous jamais allé à Lyon?
À la grande surprise du journaliste, Altman rétorque sans la moindre hésitation, en allemand, « Je ne suis jamais allé à Lyon ». L'homme a parfaitement compris la question, qui vient de lui être posée dans une langue qu'il n'est pas censé connaître.
Yeah, bro was completely cooked. When word got back to France that this mother sucker was still alive, they were pissed and demanded that the Bolivian government turn him over, which of course they refused. So Barbie continued to live in Bolivia under the protection of their government and also the CIA. Now, in addition to being a government asset, Barbie also had a lot of side hustles, like drug and arms smuggling. Barbie sold weapons to Pablo Escobar's Medellin cartel in exchange for Pablo's assistance in fighting against communists in South America. So Klaus made a lot of money from this arrangement, as well as a bunch of other illegal shit. And that money went to good use. In 1967, Barbie worked with the CIA to track down and kill Che Guevara, who had been training resistance fighters in the jungles of Bolivia. So Klaus Barbie became a rich man, and so did Banzer. The dictator had made millions from smuggling drugs into the US, which, fortunately for him, would lead to his demise. The US pressured him to resign as president, which I don't know, like, why they were okay with Noriega doing this, but not him. Maybe he wasn't as chill. So after this, the Bolivian people were promised free elections. But when the right-wing party lost the election, it was time to scrap that whole idea. In 1980, Barbie would help orchestrate what would come to be known as the cocaine coup. But he wasn't alone. His partner in crime was a guy named Stefano Chiaie, a neo-fascist terrorist who was also a member of Propaganda Due. Oh, we'll get into Propaganda Due later, but it was basically a fascist Freemason branch who secretly controlled the entire country of Italy. It's crazy stuff. I made a whole video about that too. He also had ties to the CIA. Anyways, the cocaine coup was absolutely brutal. Radio stations were bombed, people were gunned down in the streets, terrible stuff. And it was all funded by drug money, thus the name. When the smoke cleared, General Garcia Meza was made president. The first thing he did after winning was he rounded up all of his political opponents and had them all shot. He then appointed Klaus Barbie as the head of Bolivia's internal security forces. Nazis, which was basically the Gestapo again. It came full circle. But the gravy train wouldn't last forever. In 1983, Bolivia's government collapsed and a less Nazi-friendly regime came to power, which was pretty much all she wrote for the Barb. He was immediately extradited back to France and tried for multiple war crimes. It was at this point that the world became aware that the American government protected Barbie along with a bunch of other Nazis. But hey, they apologized, so, it's all cool. During his trial, Klaus's lawyer had a pretty funny defense, saying that what he had done was not even a drop in the bucket compared to the war crimes that the French themselves had committed abroad. I mean, he's not completely wrong. In 1987, he was finally sentenced to life in prison, where he would die at the age of 77.
Hi, me again, Agent Green of the PSYOP YouTube channel Necessary Information. So as Dan was editing his segment on the great, big, and beautiful Palantir technologies, we got a call from Peter Thiel, the boss man, El Jefe, if you will. Turns out he's bugged Adobe Premiere and saw everything Dan was saying about his company, and suffice it to say, he was displeased. So he has politely demanded that we here at the agency go ahead and kidnap Dan again and then double the Diddy clone count in his cell this time to really make sure that he's learned his lesson. We of course said no, that's a terrible idea, Peter. We need to at least triple it. So we settled on quadrupling the Diddy count and throwing Matthew Santoro in there for good measure. Yes, we do have a Matthew Santoro clone. So while Dan is busy with all that, I'm back to tell you the real straight skinny on Palantir Technologies. By a show of hands, who has seen the Lord of the Rings trilogy? Alright, for the few non-virgins left standing, the Lord of the Rings, so I've been told, are movies. There's a bad guy called Sirumen, or something like that, who has a certain orb that he likes to ponder. With this all-seeing orb, the evil wizard sees all. It's basically the fantasy equivalent of the NSA, which, by the way, fuck those guys. Lame-ass nerds. Anyways, this all-seeing orb was named Palantir. So way back in 2002, a young, scrappy Peter Thiel saw this maniacal all-seeing orb wielded by the very clear evil villain of this film franchise and decided that that perfectly encapsulated the goals of his new company. You can even see this reflected in the logo for Palantir, with this little circle and squiggle representing the evil orb sitting on its evil stand. Likewise, Peter Thiel also named the 3 Palantir offices after Lord of the Rings locations, with his California compound being called the Shire, his office right next door to us in Virginia, nicknamed Rivendell, and his Washington, D.C. department dubbed Minas Tirith. Oh, and also he's gay, I guess, so he likes boys. Despite this fact, initially, for some strange reason, Peter Thiel did not get much interest from the soft buy boys of early 2000s Silicon Valley for his surveillance company idea named after a mythical, evil, glowing wizard orb. During the first meeting that Thiel set up to acquire capital, the investor simply doodled through the entire meeting and told them to go kick rocks. And in the second meeting, the investor took the time to launch into a long tirade as to why their idea was very dumb, stupid, and gay, and would never work. Peter then booked a meeting with us, the CIA, who promptly gave him $2 million. This was done through the CIA's venture capital fund, a very fun and unconcerning string of words called InQtel. And let me tell you, our money really paid off here. Palantir later split into 2 factions to focus on different revenue sectors. Palantir Gotham, the one that we at the CIA use, which focused on selling its services to militaries, stand-up intelligence agencies such as ourselves, the FBI, fucking also pussies, ICE, and various police forces, as well as Palantir Foundry, which focused on the private sector. Both of these factions provided basically the same service in different flavors, data collection and delivery, with its main bread and butter being mass surveillance. We in the fine United States Big Brother departments use this service for counterterrorism, deportations, and what could be called predictive policing. Think Minority Report, that movie where that practice was very good and ethical and turned out super well for everybody involved. The private sector also uses Palantir Foundry to spy on both its customers and employees in their never-ending quest to develop an infinite money glitch and forever raise shareholder value. So, hopefully, now you can see where the naming his company after an evil, all-seeing wizard orb came from, based on their activities. Palantir and Peter Thiel himself have been embroiled in several blameless controversies and shameful witch hunts in the past that we won't go into here because the agency has deemed them untrue and un-American. Peter Thiel now spends his time pretending not to be the Antichrist by calling everybody else he doesn't like the Antichrist and giving various Antichrist speeches to other powerful potential Antichrist candidates. And that, my friends, is the agency-approved Palantir breakdown in a nutshell. Agent Green of the PSYOP YouTube channel Necessary Information signing off once again. Now back to suspected terrorist and no nitrous addict Dantavius. Please go check out my YouTube channel. It's actually not a PSYOP. It's pretty good.
The Temple of Set is an occult cult? I get, and it's an occult cult. I'm never working with this writer again. It was founded by Michael Aquino, a former member of the Church of Satan. Michael apparently had a disagreement with Anton LaVey over the Church of Satan not being demonic enough. So he branched out and formed his own group. The temple worships the Egyptian god Set, whom Aquino claims to have received a vision from in 1975. Upon receiving this revelation from Set, Aquino's eyebrows curled up like the Grinch, indicating that he was now officially an evil sorcerer. Now, Anton LaVey's Church of Satan was essentially just an edgy atheist group that pretended to worship the devil to dunk on Christians. But the Temple of Set, on the other hand, actually kind of did believe in that occult shit. The group was also a lot more exclusive and elitist compared to the COS. Now, obviously, this group has been a lightning rod for conspiracy theories, and you'll see why in a second. During the 1980s, America was in the middle of a demonic crisis. There were widespread reports of satanic cults engaging in ritual abuse, child sacrifice, and pedophilia. In what's now known as the Satanic Panic, thousands of people were accused of being part of a satanic pedo network. It kind of all started in the 70s with the release of films like Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist and stuff like that. But by the 80s, it had reached a fever pitch. At the center of this mass hysteria were groups like the Temple of Set. Now, here's where it gets very interesting. Michael A. Aquino, the A stands for Angelo, by the way, which is kind of funny, I guess, cowabunga and whatnot. Anyways, Mike was, and stop me if you know where I'm going with this, an intelligence agent, but not just any regular old intelligence agent. He specifically worked in the psychological warfare division, meaning that the dude was a literal psyop. So yeah, I mean, you can kind of see why there was a lot of conspiracy theories involving this guy. Now, one of the theories is that Aquino actually infiltrated the occult movement so that he could spy on them, but that's the most normal one. Let's talk about the more fun ones. Now, some people, not me, have said that the whole Satanic Panic thing might have been a literal psyop. Which, I mean, it's not hard to see how people came to that conclusion. One of the most prominent Satanists in America was also a master of psyops. To add another level of weirdness to this whole thing, we gotta tie it back to MKUltra. A big part of the Satanic Panic was therapists essentially implanting memories in people. There have been a bunch of books written about this, that therapists would kind of inject false memories of getting abused into their patients, which was one of the main goals of MKUltra. So, I don't know, man. I don't know what to do with all this information. You know what? This is all a joke. None of it's real. Just, you know, calm down. Just calm down. I think researching for this video is making me go crazy. Now, on the flip side, Aquino himself was accused of child molestation during the Satanic Panic, and it completely destroyed his career. He was under a months-long investigation by the police, and then he was in an even longer legal battle with his accusers. So, if he was in on it, I feel like he wouldn't do all that. Maybe, I don't know, bro. Anyways, guys, that's the end of part 1 of this video. Part 2, I will be posting on my second channel, okay, in a few days. So go subscribe to that channel and go watch part 2 when it comes out. And you know, thank you guys so much for watching.